Several years after the sudden appearance of a dungeon dubbed the Babylon Pit in Japan in 2028, the city was abuzz with breaking news. People from all over the world flocked to the country, seeking wealth and fame. Among them was the main character, the researcher. The researcher. His future life promised to unfold in a completely different world. In the gloomy steppe, a monkey with one eye, a cyclops, carefully watched the hero. He considered himself an experienced explorer, accustomed to danger. Suddenly, among the monsters, one was shot through the eye. The boy was called upon to continue his journey. The beast's mouth opened slightly, and Naruhito Toyama stood before the horde of predators. He fought the creatures, retrieving treasures and thus securing his own life. The boy brandished his weapon and declared to the monkey that he considered it his enemy. The monkey began making threatening noises. The hero assumed a fighting stance and unleashed a multitude of blows on the attacking monsters. The thought of calling himself a veteran crossed his mind. Naruhito nimbly dodged most of the attacks. Many people had died in these places. Suddenly, he felt a strong blow. Touching the body, he discovered a deep wound in the stomach. The enemy beast burst into laughter, rejoicing at its success. However, the hero, with a cry, struck back to silence the monster. But those events were now in the past. He looked down and saw a pit in front of him. His entire body was covered in cuts and bruises. It occurred to him that he might have missed another monster. He chuckled quietly to himself. The young man stood in the middle of the open space. Silence reigned all around. Naruhito tried to catch his breath, feeling the throbbing of his wound. He froze, surveying his fallen enemies. He wondered if some had managed to escape. Raising his head, the hero allowed himself to enjoy the fresh air and peace for a moment. In his thoughts, Naruhito returned to his home. The protagonist had always dreamed of building a home by the lake. He smiled, imagining the smooth surface of the water and the cool morning air. He noted the beautiful view ahead. Behind him lay a pile of fallen monsters, everything covered in blood. Suddenly, the young man remembered his PC's hard drive. He turned to look at his fallen opponents, but smiled. The guy laughed at them, calling them stupid monkeys. Bleeding profusely, Naruhito moved forward, clutching his stomach and trudging through the grass. He realized he was truly in serious trouble, and that his life could end right here. A smile touched Naruhito's lips as he moved on. Blood stained his face. He imagined the sauna he dreamed of building, so he could warm himself in it until morning. Then he wanted to cool off in the cool lake. Images of freshly baked bread floated through his mind. He imagined the various roles he wanted to obtain. The desire was very strong. He remembered the house he intended to build. Small drops of blood continued to trickle from his lips to the ground. The hero noted that he shouldn't have shown off. The young man continued walking, pondering his future home. With a new thought, he agreed. Another drop of blood fell onto the grass right in front of him. Suddenly, he remembered wanting a dog. He heard a soft bark in his head. He would prefer a Shiba Inu. He wanted a large dog with soft fur. He imagined how they would enjoy delicious food and have fun together. Then the young man lowered his head, remembering something else. He fell to his knees, frozen on the ground grass. Suddenly, Naruhito collapsed, and his entire body lay on the ground and froze. The guy didn't want to die here. He considered himself a pretty good specialist. It was no wonder he had achieved the rank of higher explorer. But the most interesting part, he thought, was only just beginning. Lying on the ground, he confirmed his reluctance to die. Killing animals was easy for him, and he had grown accustomed to the smell of their blood. Naruhito trained extensively, honing his skills in killing enemies. He easily memorized techniques. In a pinch, he could quickly flee the scene of a fight. The protagonist earned money by killing creatures and stealing treasures. Now, after so many murders, his death seemed fitting. The boy ran his hand through the grass. His eyes began to close. Naruhito wondered what he would do if he could run faster. He became an explorer to fulfill his dreams. He remembered his former self. The hero realized that life isn't always easy. Nevertheless, he believed that a brighter future awaited him. He always looked ahead. But he still lay motionless. Naruhito realized that death was inevitable. Today was that day. He exhaled and tried to savor the moment. Suddenly, a question arose in his mind about where he had gone wrong. Perhaps it was when he accepted this task. He was told it would be quite simple. The young man chuckled. Perhaps he was wrong to protect his friends when he told them to run. Or maybe when he started them. The boy remembered the faces of his family. Perhaps the mistake was somewhere else. The protagonist burst into tears. He couldn't understand whether his greatest mistake was becoming a researcher in the first place. Suddenly, he burst into tears. He admitted that he enjoyed fighting, killing, earning money, and eating good food. But there were contradictions to all of this. The researcher looked up resolutely. Naruhito resolved that next time he would definitely not repeat his mistakes. He made a point of not acting rashly. He would definitely use his trump card. Then he began to slowly rise from the grass. Suddenly, he heard the rustling of grass and became scared. The guy looked up and saw something in front of him that looked like a natural phenomenon. Naruhito wasn't surprised, but simply began to sink into the ground. The hero realized that his death was now inevitable. But he still fell. Suddenly, a man with a radio from the cave spoke to Naruhito, informing him that reinforcements were being sent, that everyone was safe, and that Hina was alive thanks to him. He asked the hero to just hold on. The protagonist asked his friend to listen to his plea. Naruhito asked his comrade to destroy the hard drive on his tablet, as well as all books containing images of elven girls. His interlocutor began shouting in response, calling him insane and expressing outrage at such a strange request. The protagonist began to sink deeper, and a smile blossomed on his face. He realized that now it was definitely over. He trusted his friend to get rid of all the junk. One could say the hero had won and felt happy. Naruhito laughed even louder, noting that it had been fun and promising himself that next time would be even better. He planned to build a house and open his own store. He thought about the prospect of greater freedom in the future. The young man will also have money, food, a dog, and a family. He cursed quietly, but the smile never left his face. High-class researcher Naruhito Toyama died on the second level of the dungeon. The earth sucked him deep inside. The support team failed to locate the deceased's body. The next day, special teams were dispatched. They concluded that a natural disaster had occurred, caused by a landslide. They followed a trail of blood. However, no one knew where exactly Toyama was now. The protagonist slowly began to open his eyes and felt a slight tingling sensation. He noted to himself that he was dead after all. But now he heard something. A voice from within thanked him for the fun he'd had in his little garden. It insisted that he could be him. He wasn't Naruhito himself, of course, but he was very much like him. He hated losing and had a strong will. However, he couldn't stay here. After all, the protagonist had died. This place was his final destination. But would he be satisfied? An unknown female voice announced that it would allow Naruhito to continue to exist. However, this would not happen in the world in which he lived. The protagonist was told not to worry. There was a place that was perfect for him. After all, he could become the one. She was already impatient to find out what awaited the protagonist next. She wanted to see him transform. The goddess decided to give him a gift that would ease his further journey, a guiding arrow. It was meant to help the young man. Now the boy's life continued in another world. He transitioned from version 1.0 to the unknown. He inherited the explorer's abilities. He also retained all his skills and weapons. As an additional bonus, he received an arrow with active quests. The dark room, filled with barrels and people, began to brighten. The protagonist opened his eyes. Before him lay a multitude of boxes and a commotion. He took a breath and coughed. Naruhito looked around, completely confused as to where he was or what was happening. He noticed that his hands were handcuffed. A magic arrow was flying next to him. The young man was completely perplexed by what had just happened. He looked at the signpost. He saw an arrow hovering above it. He thought he was dreaming. Suddenly, someone addressed him from the side. The voice expressed joy at finally waking up. The young man shuddered and assumed a puzzled expression. Suddenly, a small lizard appeared right in front of him. An arrow pointed directly at him next to it. The lizard looked questioningly at the protagonist. The protagonist died after sustaining a serious wound and was caught in a natural disaster. When he woke up, he found himself in a strange place. The young man froze, staring ahead in horror. He couldn't comprehend how real what was happening was. A lizard, with an arrow indicating it was a servant, approached him. The lizard expressed relief that Naruhito had finally woken up. He asked if the boy had gotten caught trying to get through the checkpoint. The lizard added that they had both had bad luck on this trip. The protagonist looked away, his stomach churning with hunger. Suddenly, the stranger held out a piece of bread. He offered the guy to eat it, explaining that he baked it himself. The hero looked at the proffered bread. Unsure of what was happening, he looked up. The arrow indicated that dialogue with the lizard servant was possible. The lizard lowered its head and apologized. He assumed it would be disgusting to eat what the lizard had prepared. Suddenly, Naruhito snatched the bread from the stranger's hands. He declared he would eat it all if possible and began stuffing the bun into his mouth. The lizard was delighted that his treat had been accepted. The boy began chewing and asked if it was okay to do that. Taking another bite, he remarked that the bread was very tasty. The lizard beamed with happiness, a smile lighting up his face. He was slightly embarrassed, but genuinely happy. The protagonist noticed that the arrow above the stranger's head had disappeared. Then the boy decided to ask about the handcuffs. The lizardman explained that those carrying them were beastmen, as they had good hearing. The stranger added that he had removed his own with a master key. Naruhito was surprised by his agility and thought he was having an interesting dream. The lizard folded his arms and expressed joy at finally meeting a good man. He began to pray to God for the gratitude shown. The hero didn't understand why the lizard was sitting there, since he had shared his food. Suddenly, the cart stopped. They noted that they had arrived, and now they needed to be careful, as the beastmen were very hot-tempered. The cart stopped, and all the prisoners were pulled out. The young man looked around and saw a multitude of beastmen around him. Among them, girls with cat ears stood out. Naruhito remarked that these ears looked very cute. He thought the girls looked like sisters. They were ordered to move on, and he was led ahead. The boy, still handcuffed, nodded in agreement and walked away, looking around. Suddenly, someone spoke to him from the side, causing him to flinch. A man in wolf form attacked him and punched him in the stomach with all his might. The wolf sharply asked if Naruhito had been looking at the girls, and how dare he even look in their direction. The wolf's face looked terrifying. Soon his comrades called him over, laughing at how he'd handled the prisoner. Meanwhile, the prisoner sat on the ground, feeling the pain from the blow quite real. He thought that 2 more blows like that would surely kill him. The lizardman approached Naruhito and asked if he was all right, noting that they appeared to be adventurers. The hero asked if the guild members were adventurers. The lizardman confirmed that they were their servants. The wolves discussed the need to stick together. The protagonist looked around. The dream seemed very real to him. Behind him, they were talking about his returning luck. The boy couldn't tell if he was alive. Suddenly, the wolf struck the man who had blocked his way. He looked very stern, baring his teeth and shouting that he would tear everyone apart. Many people moved forward. Naruhito looked around. He remembered that on the brink of death, someone had said something to him, but he couldn't quite remember. The lizard was driven from behind to make it move faster. The young man noticed that there was another person ahead, and everyone was pushing each other forward. The lizard was ordered to be quiet, and they also noticed something had fallen from his hands. The wolf picked up the rolled bundle and expressed surprise that he had been hiding something. He also shouted that since he'd passed the commander's test, it was improper to treat him like trash. The lizard explained that he'd baked the bread so that someone hungry could eat it. The wolf decided he wanted to burn the bread and stepped on it. The lizard was upset. The wolves gathered in a group and began discussing what could be worse than the bread the lizard had baked. They emphasized that it was unpleasant. The lizard lowered his head and stared at the piece of bread, bewildered by their words. Suddenly, the protagonist came closer and picked up a piece of bread. He sighed, noting that it would be a shame to throw away such food, and picked up the entire loaf from the floor. The lizard didn't understand his actions. Suddenly, the boy stuffed the bread into his mouth and Naruhito began gnawing greedily. The wolves, frozen right in front of him, couldn't comprehend what was happening. The boy declared it was very tasty. He asked the lizard if there was any more bread. It explained that this was the last loaf. The boy stood up and asked for more, offering to pay for it. He remarked that the bread was very filling. The protagonist added that this was the 3rd such incident, and now all wolves really irritate him. Everyone around was perplexed. The boy stepped forward and explained that they were trash that threw away food. Moreover, they are the worst of all, because they also step on bread. Naruhito claimed that he is a researcher and that he exterminates such animals very easily. The boy decided to firmly adhere to his principles and live his life accordingly. He vowed to do so even in his dreams. The wolf approached him and asked what he was muttering about, and whether he wanted to be hit. Suddenly, the wolf retreated. The protagonist raised his stern gaze and advised him to take a shower, as he smelled foul. The wolf became enraged and began attacking the boy. When Naruhito Toyama encountered the attacking wolf, everything around him was illuminated by a blinding light. The protagonist noticed that his opponent was weak, and the handcuffs instantly fell apart. He used a trick, using his hand as a shield to blind his opponent. The wolf, blinded, dropped his weapon and, shielding his eyes, collapsed to the ground. Despite his tears, the boy explained that it was impossible to lose a weapon in the middle of a fight and picked up the fallen blade. The second wolf expressed amazement. Immediately, the protagonist, armed with an axe, began to deal with the advancing enemies. He recognized one of them as the one who had struck him earlier and vowed revenge on the approaching wolf. As the wolf swung, Naruhito used his sword as a distraction and then delivered a precise blow. He explained that it was a retaliatory blow for the previous attack. The axe sank straight into the enemy's furry chest. He fell, and the boy rose above his fallen enemy. At that moment, the hero muttered something about the solar plexus. Suddenly, an information window appeared before the hero, informing him that the assigned objective had been completed. Now, the primary objective was immediate escape. The boy noted with satisfaction the convenience of the new system. The lizard, watching the scene, was in complete shock. The hero turned to him and asked if he was injured. Then he addressed everyone gathered, urging them to hurry. Suddenly, the people around him began to converge on the protagonist. The crowd was shouting that they needed to destroy him immediately. The guy, looking around and stretching his shoulders, asked if they were already aiming at him, noting their astonishing speed. The lizard standing behind him shook with fear. However, Naruhito reassured him. The hero promised that he would not risk his life anymore and ran his hand over his neck. He decided to use a special technique. Thick steam billowed from his mouth, enveloping everything around him. The lizard looked around in confusion. The entire space was flooded with fog, and the adventurers began to look around. They couldn't understand the source of this darkness, which had also impaired their sense of smell. Even if they were on the first floor of the Helia Tower, such a veil was unheard of. The two cat-eared girls huddled close together. The lizard continued to peer around, but saw nothing. Suddenly, the protagonist approached him from behind and called out to him, urging him to move while he still had the chance. The lizard understood. The joyful guy rushed forward, rejoicing that his plan had worked. They had managed to escape. The lizard asked if he could see where they were going. Naruhito explained that he couldn't see anything except the signpost, which was a convenient marker for the game. She continued to guide him. However, at the most inopportune moment, the protagonist slipped and began to fall. Together with the lizard, they rolled across the slippery floor, screaming in horror. The descent became steeper and steeper. The heroes lost their balance and fell straight into the pit with a loud scream. An explosion was heard, and at that moment, a man in patent leather shoes entered another room. He turned to the lady shining in the sun and announced that the time had come. The little maid approached the girl and reported that her armor was ready. The mistress passed by, noting that she found the whole thing unbearably boring. She lamented that if this boredom continued, she would only be left to pray to some angel for someone to appear who could dispel her melancholy in front of his subjects. The lady continued on her way, accompanied by her subjects. For them, it was like a mock battle with their main adversary. Naruhito turned to the little dog, noticing that it, like him, had no home. The dog barked in response. The young man thought of it again, wondering what would happen if the dog weren't hostile. Suddenly, the boy found himself asleep and dreaming. The lizard asked if the young man was breathing, and if he recognized him. He apologized, but urged the hero to wake up. The protagonist woke up, sat up, and asked where they were. They were in a strange place, and they themselves had no idea where they were. There were numerous crystals all around, and a clear liquid was seeping from the ceiling. The boy scratched his head, noting he'd just woken up. He thought again about the dream and what it could mean. The lizard had asked him for help. The hero shuddered, turned around, rose to his feet, and took a step forward. Right in front of him, he saw something new. He was about to defeat the enormous giant who stood before his comrades. The Cyclops growled loudly and glared at the heroes. Naruhito noted that it looked like they wouldn't be friends. The lizardman, however, was perplexed as to who this Cyclops was and why he was here. Suddenly, the enemy swung sharply and attacked the heroes. They began to defend themselves, trying to avoid the blows. At that moment, the young man laughed, declaring that if he got hit by the Cyclops even once, he would surely be finished. The lizardman didn't understand what was so funny about that. However, the boy asked what it was, as the Cyclops appeared before him, preparing for another attack. He was very interested in using his powers in combat. He swung his arm to throw. Suddenly, a stone hit the lizard right in the eye. The opponent froze. The stone bounced off him. Naruhito asked why the lizard didn't drop the axe. The Cyclops, meanwhile, was rubbing his eye. Suddenly, his hand reached out to the boy. He trembled slightly with fear. But he wondered what kind of idiot smiles in the face of death. Suddenly, a girl dressed in knightly armor appeared out of nowhere. She landed right on top of the Cyclops. With a few swings of her weapon, she quickly dispatched the giant, and remarked that she was very bored. She added that it wasn't even a good way to kill time. The protagonist, surprised, asked her if she was serious. The lizardman was shocked. She had defeated the Cyclops with a single blow, something that seemed impossible even for experienced adventurers. Suddenly, the savior noticed the heroes and, aiming her weapon, rushed to attack. The armored knight claimed they were the ones who had disturbed her. She clarified that it was a real lizard in front of her, and that the heroes had previously become servants and tried to escape. Suddenly, the protagonist froze. The lizard lowered his head and trembled, believing this couldn't have happened. He muttered that she was a dragon. The knight understood his words and said she knew everything. She noted that it was quite good. She could even praise him. But what about this man? What's wrong with him? The lizard didn't understand what the knight was talking about. He tilted his new comrade. The boy didn't understand what was happening. He resisted. The knight asked why Naruhito was acting like this. The lizard advised the boy to lower his head. After all, he was their dragon, a top-class adventurer. The knight explained that there was no need to praise her so much. The girl approached the hero and said he smelled foul. She remarked that she was very curious about how they managed to get rid of the shackles. The boy felt a strong pressure from the side. He thought he was facing a monster. The knight explained that things were much more interesting up there now than down there. The hero decided it was a dream and shared his thoughts with the lizard. The lizard asked the young man to behave more decently. The girl declared herself bored and suggested entertainment, which alarmed the hero. The lizard, kneeling, asked about his plans. The knight explained that they would fight to the death. She promised to free the victor and lead him out of this place. She swore this on her own name. Suddenly, the boy's goal changed. Now, he needed to defeat the lizard and finally gain freedom. The lizard was surprised by the necessity of a mortal duel. The knight emphasized that she would not repeat her words. She asked if no one could hear her. The girl sat down on the ground, reminding them that they wanted to see the award with their own eyes. She showed them a small but very brightly glowing pendant. The dragon explained that it was a sign of ecclesiastical elevation. Possessing it, one could shed the stigma of being a servant and survive in the tower. Moreover, this artifact opened the door to settling in her city, a dream for servants. She promised to give it to the winner. Naruhito and the lizard exchanged glances. The boy completely misunderstood her words. He couldn't imagine what would happen if he got this item. The lizard froze, lost in thought. The knight tossed something to the lizard, explaining that he needed a weapon. She called it a modest gift for the clever lizard and asked him to use it. It was her knife. He needed to handle it properly. The lizardman froze, clutching the dragon's knife. The knight began shouting in her harsh voice, demanding that they begin the contest and fight. Otherwise, she said, they would not survive. Suddenly, the lizard swung at the protagonist. He jumped back a few steps, shocked by what was happening. The boy wondered again if this was a dream. Was it even possible? The lizard was deftly wielding the knife. He was already acting quite aggressively. However, the point was that he needed to win this battle. The knight remarked that she didn't understand what was happening. She declared that if no one acted, she would kill them both. The lizardman remembered the bread he had prepared. The protagonist also reflected on his reluctance to kill his new comrade. Suddenly, the knife fell to the ground with a clang. The boy froze in surprise. The lizard turned to the knight and began his speech. He explained that his long-time dream was to build a small shop by the lake, looking ahead and smiling. The lizard imagined this store, not necessarily a large one. He also really wanted his best friend to come there. They could eat the bread he had prepared together. The knight listened attentively to his speech, sitting on a raised platform. The lizard explained that this was exactly his dream, and today it came true. It was the first time his bread had been eaten, and even praised for its taste. He recalled the protagonist's words. The lizard fell to the ground. He admitted he didn't want to die, but at the same time, he was incredibly happy that his dream had come true. He sank even lower. He expressed shame at himself for having considered killing his new comrade for even a second. He no longer cared what would happen to himself. He was grateful to the heavens for sending Naruhito to him. The protagonist turned out to be a very good person. He even got angry at the adventurers for throwing away his bread. The lizard turned to the dragon, continuing to talk about Naruhito's kindness. The dragon rose from his seat. She explained that she had become too bored. The lizard hadn't lived up to her expectations. It hadn't even occurred to her that he could defend himself in such a way, taking advantage of such a chance. The dragon declared she was too bored. She tossed the medallion to the protagonist, telling him to rejoice, as he had won. The knight pointed her finger and motioned for Naruhito to take the artifact and say his name. The medallion glowed in his hands, emitting a faint light. The knight raised her hand, reflecting on how dragons never break their promises, even if it was tiring. The protagonist twirled the jewelry and asked what she intended to do with the lizard. She explained that it was natural, and that only one of the two would survive, so the boy should leave the scene as quickly as possible. Suddenly, Naruhito tossed the amulet. The dragon continued, explaining that the lizard's death would be the cause of his life, and that this must be accepted. The protagonist deftly caught the tossed medallion and smiled. He began to chuckle. The knight turned around and asked if she was imagining things, or if Naruhito was actually laughing at her words. He explained that she was more terrifying than anyone he'd ever fought. Suddenly, the boy asked the lizard to raise its head. He was trembling with fear, surrounded by tension, and begged his new comrade to leave before it was too late. The protagonist told him not to say that, noticing that he didn't even recognize the lizard's name. He sat with his head bowed, surrounded by various icons. The lizard introduced himself as Lazar. He explained that he had no last name and was simply a dirty lizard named Lazar, just a kind traveler. The protagonist introduced himself as Naruhito Toyama. He clarified that his last name was Toyama and that he was a dungeon-obsessed explorer. The lizard didn't understand what this meant. Naruhito asked Lazar to extend his hand and tossed the medallion straight toward him. The lizard looked at the artifact. It began to glow in his eyes. The protagonist uttered Lazar's name, and he too began to glow. The lizard froze, unsure what was happening. Naruhito explained that he would be having a business conversation with the lizard, and he was very pleased about it. They shook hands together. Lazar was beaming and perplexed. The protagonist asked the lizard to keep going and try not to turn back. Suddenly, Lazar teleported back. Finally, he loudly shouted Naruhito's name. The hero glanced at his hand, where the artifact rested, and declared that it was now necessary to deal with the knight. The protagonist noted that this stupid signpost had previously shown everything incorrectly. The main quest was interrupted, and the current course of events was destroyed. The boy reported that the one who was supposed to die here was standing right in front of him. This man turned out to be a knight. He looked like a dark spot. Suddenly, a new, hidden quest opened up. This creature turned out to be none other than a dragon. The dragon approached the protagonist, declaring that she found him extremely unpleasant. The new task involved hunting. Naruhito asked the knight not to worry, promising to strengthen her feelings. The quest objective was updated to destroy the dragon. The knight noticed that she could praise the protagonist. It was the first time she had ever seen someone so confident. Naruhito rubbed his neck, perplexed by what was happening. After all, his mood had recently been upbeat. He made a strangled sound. Suddenly, the hero remembered someone. He noted that the dragon was very reminiscent of an old acquaintance of his. This acquaintance, it turned out, was the lead researcher. The knight didn't understand what this meant. However, she remarked that it made no difference to her, and warned Naruhito to be prepared for death, for only one would survive. He chuckled, insisting that if anyone survived, it would be himself. Suddenly, the girl laughed. Her laughter shook the entire space and made the earth tremble. Everything around her began to vibrate. Suddenly, the girl stopped laughing and explained that this had to end. She swung her trident spear, slamming it hard into the ground, and assumed a fighting stance, preparing for combat. She activated the weapon, causing a bright flash and sparks of lightning that made the hero feel the heat. He realized this weapon would create problems and require effort. The dragon laughed louder, praising the hero for his composure. She rushed straight at the boy, shaking everything in her path. the knight noted that he was keeping her busy. The protagonist remained standing calmly, not taking a single step. Suddenly, his expression changed. He explained that the knight was an idiot, since she would be the sacrifice. For Earth, where the dungeons appeared in 2028, this was something capable of defying the laws of physics and chemistry. Naruhito Toyama recalled the event that changed the world. All his preparations were complete. A foul odor began to fill the space. The knight froze, surprised by the aroma. She couldn't understand what it meant. People called this phenomenon by different names. Naruhito, however, noted that it was time to act. A burning aroma emanated from his body. He explained that he would now receive the dispersal. He took the blade and immersed it in the dark aura emanating from him. He said he was using the finest particles. Suddenly, the weapon began to melt and evaporate, turning into a wave of dark, burning matter emanating from the boy. Suddenly, he pointed the blade straight at his opponent. He shouted for them to fill with blades and held the weapon in front of him. Suddenly, the knight running toward him tripped over the weapon flying at her. Naruhito explained that he was lucky the enemy was on the open side. The blades now extended over a 50-meter radius. It was necessary to disperse these tiny blade particles into the air. Even with such armor, the dragon would be unable to defend itself. The girl began to scream in pain. Her body began to burn. She screamed, begging for it to stop. Naruhito began to laugh at his opponent. The dragon sank to the ground, unable to move. The protagonist noted that all her armor had been destroyed. At that moment, he himself began to feel ill. He felt unwell and moved away from what was happening, beginning to vomit. The guy wiped his mouth and noted that he hadn't vomited from such a sight in a long time. But at least he had won. He was very pleased with it. Suddenly, the boy looked at his hand and began to tremble with anticipation. He realized this sensation was definitely not a dream. He sat up and saw the arrow hovering over his opponent's fallen body. Suddenly, the dragon's light wings opened, filling the entire space around with blinding light. A multitude of stones flew off. The dragon spread its wings even wider. It flapped them, and everything around began to shake. The dragon chuckled and turned its gaze on the protagonist. Naruhito turned to his opponent, who was shaking again from the blows. The protagonist replied that he had mixed fine blade particles with the air. The opponent forgot about it. The dragon was attacked again and collapsed to the ground, unable to move. The protagonist explained that these blades penetrate the body and begin their action there. His opponent, however, only laughed. He was unable to move. Naruhito looked his opponent straight in the face and noted that everything had gone perfectly. The guy was very serious and decided to finally crush his opponent. The protagonist stood before his fallen enemy, clutching a dagger. He pondered what to do with the defeated dragon. Naruhito decided he wouldn't be able to sleep peacefully until he finished her off. The boy glanced at the weapon, noting its excellent quality. It was a knight's blade, and he decided to return it. The young man plunged the knife into the body of the defeated enemy and won the victory. Pulling back slightly, he noted that it was unpleasant to watch what was happening. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to an arrow appearing at the bottom of the screen. It pointed to the body of the defeated dragon and displayed a notification that the hunt had ended. The next moment, everything around him vanished, shrouded in smoke. The protagonist exclaimed that it had finally happened. He said goodbye to the lifeless armor lying on the floor. The hidden dragon hunt quest had been successfully completed. A new dragon attack skill had been unlocked, and this particular dragon species had been added to his collection. At the same time, peace reigned in the Heller Tower. Agatal, the southern territory of the Empire, was the location of the Adventurers Guild. The manager, Margrave Sipan von Tichy, was shocked by the news and cried out in amazement. The plump man bent over, not believing his ears, and asked in bewilderment why something like this was happening in his life. He started rolling around the guild floor until a girl approached him. She addressed the manager, noticing he was making too much noise. The Margrave called out Marie's name. The girl slapped him across the face, apologizing that she hadn't meant to hurt him. The manager muttered that she had a fine punch. Marie replied that they were black, today, and would record the incident in the meeting minutes. She shook her head. Marie wondered what had happened, as it was rare to find the manager in such a state. The man wiped the floor and pointed in the opposite direction. The girl didn't understand what he meant. This was the fire of the chosen ones. The lamp of this device reflected the vital status of the highest guilds of adventurers. It contained 7 candles, but one was missing. The girl looked closely. She began counting, explaining that there should be exactly 7 lights, but there were only 6. This puzzled her. The Margrave explained that his reaction was the same. He began drinking his tea and took a sip. Suddenly he screamed, "One dragon dead." The man collapsed to the floor and began convulsing. He lamented that they were the strongest, and now one of the 7 lives had been extinguished. The girl explained that, as far as she knew, they were going to Heller's Tower today. The steward said he had to report the incident to the capital, perplexed by the reasons. Marie reassured him, asked about the outcome of his actions, and suggested starting the discussion from the beginning. The Margrave was surprised and reminded him of his higher status. Marie explained that they first needed to send a mission to find the remaining high-ranking dragons. The man agreed, though he assumed the emperor was already aware of the death. Marie explained that no dragon had died in 200 years. The last time this happened was during the Great War, when the fire dragon was killed. However, it later took its revenge. It would have been easier if they had only 1 life, but they are immortal. The Empire should have been notified of the upcoming Dragon Festival. The manager turned around and suggested that it would be better if they reported it first, since the dragon would be back soon. Marie was delighted that the Margrave had taken the matter on, chiding him for his lack of seriousness without pressure. The Margrave agreed that he was forced to act and expressed displeasure at the criticism, but was glad that the goal was within reach, believing that nothing could be worse than the death of a dragon. The girl informed the manager that a high-ranking adventurer was in the guild. The manager was delighted and asked who it was. Marie adjusted her glasses and suggested asking the woman to take on the case of the deceased dragon. She clarified that she was talking about the former archer of the hero party, Lady Van Verbana. Hearing this, the manager cried out in fear. He expressed his reluctance to get involved with her. At that moment, his stomach growled loudly and he began to shake. The 3rd century arrived, the 28th year, the 12th day of the month of flower blossoms. On this day, an event occurred that shook the entire empire. A group of dragon priestesses is what binds the empire and the dragon world together. And now, one of the 7 dragons has fallen at the hands of an unknown being. In memory of the deceased, and in honor of the promised revival, it was proposed to hold a dragon festival. The empire eventually agreed that the festival would still go ahead. As a result of this decision, the empire's economy immediately boomed. The upsurge affected all strata, from the merchant guilds to the adventurers' guilds. He also touched on the development of adventurers into various establishments. From the red light district, word of this spread throughout the empire. In Agatal stood the tall tower of Heller. The doors on the 1st floor opened, and a girl came down. She began to slowly descend the steps. The girl passed a pool-like waterfall where a clear, almost shimmering liquid flowed. Nearby, an untouched body lay. The dragon, slain by a dagger, lay in its own dried blood. The person who entered found this picture boring. It seemed to the dragon that there was nothing left in this world that could interest her. Suddenly, someone addressed her from behind. The butler praised what he had seen, declaring that everything was excellent, as always, especially with his eyes closed. The girl turned to her grandfather. The butler was concerned about the girl's mood, but she replied that it was just a fairy tale. Her mother's tale had lost its meaning for her. The heroine had always considered life joyful and full of things worth fighting for and conquering, as her parents had taught her. It turned out to be different. The man, addressing the girl, suggested that her parents wanted her to enjoy life. He added that she was still too young for such gloomy thoughts. The girl noted that her mother had told her the same thing. But now she didn't care about anything at all. It would be better for her to know nothing. Neither the truth about that fairy tale, nor about weak people. The heroine noted that she should have simply continued to observe. Then this world would be no different from the world of dragons. And she wondered what she could do to alleviate her unbearable boredom. The clergy seemed boring to her. The knights were weak. Even the royal dragon cult held no interest. No one among the humans was intelligent enough to challenge a dragon, so they merely worshipped it. The question arose, who would then be ready to interest her? Perhaps adventurers and heroes? As far as she knew, people created their own heroes. But was that true? The girl paused, looking into the distance, contemplating her future. The dragon grinned, baring her teeth, and thought that perhaps she should destroy this world. Her eyes transformed. The man standing next to her shook his head, noting that she would never do such a thing. The girl stepped onto the floor, and it immediately sank beneath her feet. She asked her assistant how she could then combat the overwhelming boredom. The man suggested that a human would quench the thirst for this struggle. The girl lowered her head and repeated her mentor's words. The dragon explained that people are all the same. They have something in common that makes them say one thing and think another. She was always told she was very beautiful, but they noted the coldness in her eyes. They also told her that as a dragon, she was quite terrifying. It was the protagonist who turned to the dragon, declaring that he would do as he wanted. She remembered his smug grin and satisfied expression. The girl moved her leg. Suddenly, the dragon opened her eyes. She found herself covered in blood. Looking around, she realized she was dead. The girl remembered Naruhito's face and realized it was he who had killed her. The heroine pulled the knife from her chest and began laughing loudly. She tossed the weapon aside and sat up. Everything around her was ablaze with light. She noted that she became very interested. Suddenly, there was movement behind her. The dragon, addressing Van Furbane, declared that it was she. The girl aimed her bow and arrows, but then lowered her weapons. Suddenly, the dragon began to laugh. She announced to everyone that she had finally returned. The girl walked down the corridor. She instructed her butler to find her a human servant with black hair. She noted that this is the one who killed her, and if they do not find this person, the connection with people will be broken. Everyone present was terrified and saddened. But the girl assured them that if they brought the killer, she would establish an eternal bond between the dragons and the Empire. As a reward, she promised her latest collection. This is how economic growth was maintained. This meant that the dragon's death promised something great. The economy flourished. The man who attacked the dragon was never found. The girl asked the butler what number the boy she'd found was. The butler confirmed he was number 12. 4 teams had already brought in fake assassins. The dragon considered them hypocritical, but the real killer was good at hiding. The girl remembered the main character. She decided that he would definitely be hers. Meanwhile, Naruhito cringed, feeling an unpleasant chill run through his body. Time moved forward, inexorably. Naruhito returned to the battlefield. The compass needle indicated the need to butcher the carcass. He prayed for the fallen enemy, wishing him not to be reborn. The hero noted a spear, a robe, and golden armor on the enemy's body. He also noticed a sign. It turned out to be a token. Naruhito turned it over in his hands and decided to keep it for himself. The hero noticed the dagger stuck into it. Suddenly, crocodiles began looking at the boy from afar, their gaze fixated on him. Water splashed behind Naruhito. He was about to collect valuable materials. The young man stood before the dragon's remains. He knew he was taking a risk. His blades were excellent, but he was running out of time. Much depended on the wind's direction, and preparation took time. Naruhito was lucky the lizard had fallen for his trick. The fact that the enemy was relaxed, unaware of the hero's trump card, and fought, ignoring the changes in the atmosphere. All factors contributed to Naruhito's victory. With the token, the hero believed he could escape the cave. He noted that this was his first finished-off opponent, and the feeling was quite pleasant. Suddenly, he clicked his tongue and grinned. It was no different from his previous encounters with monsters. The vast dungeon intoxicated him. The dangerous influence that the very possibility opened before him was what mattered. It simply erased all boundaries of reason. Gradually losing his mind, the man turned into an explorer. Hours, Prince, as 3 years as a researcher had completely altered his consciousness. He couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. He stared intently at the amulet. The young man promised himself that he wouldn't die this time, vowing to preserve the lives of both himself and his companions. He gripped the pendant tighter and exhaled. Suddenly, he announced his full name, Toyama Naruhito. Nothing happened. The boy found himself in the same place, in front of the dragon's body. The young man continued to shout his name, clutching the token and shouting louder and louder, but he didn't understand why there was absolutely no reaction. The boy collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily. He was surprised by the lack of any response. He decided the token's power must simply not be working. The alligators from the dark water continued to stare at him. Suddenly, one of them crept even closer. The protagonist felt movement behind him. There was a huge crocodile there, staring straight at him. The young man was surprised by what had happened. He couldn't understand why they had come ashore. The reptiles were rapidly approaching him. They opened their mouths and began growling loudly at the young man. He wondered why they were focusing on him, and why they were making such terrifying sounds. The crocodiles grew in number. They continued to emerge from the water, heading straight for Naruhito. The boy realized they were apparently drawn to the scent of blood. He immediately turned to the crocodiles. They turned their attention to him. The young man pointed to the dragon's body and explained that it wasn't a relative. If they needed meat, it was right there in front of them. He continued pointing at the fallen carcass. The dragons snorted and seemed to laugh. They didn't understand what was happening. They rushed at the hero, and then he realized that his end awaited him. He thought that crocodiles preferred live prey. He noted their astonishing speed. Moreover, there were so many of them. They opened their jaws, emitting loud cries. Naruhito used the dispersion technique. He commanded the blades to work. He lamented that he could no longer see anything. He asked for an arrow to appear to show him the way forward. The side quest had begun. The protagonist was pleased that the arrow pointed in the right direction. However, he noticed that the signs were too bizarre. Suddenly, Naruhito tripped and felt a strong pressure. A crocodile appeared right in front of him and struck. The boy was puzzled why they didn't use sight or hearing, but instead used an infrared-based ability. The protagonist exclaimed that these reptiles were apparently friends of the snakes. Naruhito cursed. He ordered his blades to work. But suddenly, he demanded that everyone stop. A sudden warning came. He needed to duck as low as possible and dodge the blow. The protagonist used his power and rushed forward at high speed. Van Verbana noted that Naruhito had excellent reflexes and a hawk's eye. She also mentioned his skillful use of wind power. A combat capability assessment was conducted to test the ability to kill crocodiles without injuring them. The M66 weapon, it turned out, was designed for the elimination of living targets. Van Verbana began using her magical abilities and bow. Suddenly, everything around her was illuminated by a bright light. She used the call sign, Sierra the Special. The girl noticed that her target was already engaged and released a powerful arrow. The crocodiles panicked in response. The protagonist, watching the scene, thought they were just joking. Then, a multitude of rocks began bouncing off each other. Naruhito realized she had a bow and arrow. One of these arrows flew toward the enemy and struck him accurately. The girl quickly checked the target's condition and noted an increase in combat effectiveness. She mentally chided herself for not getting carried away by what was happening. She then turned to him, expressing the opinion that it would be better for them both to stick together. The girl asked the protagonist if he was hurt. She also noted that the young man had been quite lucky. He froze, peering intently into her face. He was completely stunned and confused. The girl in the hat asked what had happened and extended her hand to him. The young man didn't understand the reason, but the girl explained that it was a negative thing. She described his features, black hair and brown eyes, and identified him as Japanese, to which he agreed. She suddenly froze. The girl began her analysis. Perhaps the hero was familiar to her. Naruhito was confused, not understanding the nature of the analysis. At that moment, Van Verbana flinched, startling him as well. She smiled, as if realizing something. Suddenly, her hair began to braid. An energy field formed around her. The girl explained that they hadn't seen each other for a long time and turned to the Japanese man. He still couldn't figure out who stood before him. But the girl clarified that, for Vetra, this was their second meeting, and for him, it was their first. She noted that this tower was truly intriguing and a jumble of things. This was their point of contact. The guy asked her if she was okay. She answered yes, but added that she had her own peculiarities. She apologized for confusing him and again expressed her pleasure at meeting a Japanese man. The young man continued to insistently ask who it was. The girl placed her hand over her heart and introduced herself as Van Verbana Gilbazor Talks. She smirked and added that she was just an ordinary traveler. The young man's face registered confusion as he considered what he had just heard. The savior explained that Vetra had no close memories connected to humans and therefore nothing could be done. Naruhito froze, trying to process all this information. Van Verbana warned him to be careful and not to throw blades around. Then she spoke the name of Toyama Naruhito. He winced at hearing his full name. He genuinely didn't understand who stood before him, so he turned to the girl. She assumed that she would most likely become his future enemy. Naruhito Toyama froze, not understanding her words. However, he noted that the girl looked very sweet. Suddenly, she turned to the air, to Mars, declaring that she wanted to talk to him, as he could certainly listen, and asked him not to be angry. She suggested not staying there, as there was a camp nearby. The girl asked if she could accompany the protagonist there. The guy asked what she would say if he refused. The girl replied that the protagonist was human and laid out her conditions. Van Verbana declared that if he agreed, she would tell him about his current situation. Besides, she had some delicious tea. The young man was surprised by her presence, and this became a compelling argument for him. After some time, they both found themselves in the camp. After they made a fire, Naruhito asked the girl how to address her. She explained that he could just call her when. The address confused her. He assumed she was afraid of him. However, the girl laughed and said something interesting. She revealed that she was an elf. The guy jokingly asked if she was a masochist. But Wen quickly retorted that he wasn't. Wen decided to get to the heart of their conversation. They both drank tea, deciding to discuss pressing matters. Wen briefly informed Naruhito that he was now alive. This was neither a dream nor a continuation of an illusion. The young man shuddered at these words. He looked at his cup and noted how delicious the tea tasted. The girl asked him to live in reality. After all, he himself had found himself in this place. She explained, if Mars didn't react at all, it confirmed that the protagonist was truly Japanese, especially purebred. Wen admitted that she never thought the day would come when she would just have tea with a hero. She herself found it hard to believe what was happening. The warmth of the fire continued to warm the young man. The girl took a small sip of tea, and Naruhito followed suit. Silence fell. Naruhito decided to confirm one thing once again. He declared that he was indeed alive. These words were confirmed, and the hero truly existed in this world. This was not a hallucination, but genuine reality. The girl explained that everything happening now was simply unfolding in another world. Van Verbana explained that this wasn't Japan, but a completely different place. She clarified that this was a different world. The girl nodded, realizing this must have come as a surprise to the man. However, he interrupted her. The man glowed with anticipation. He was overjoyed to be reborn in another world. The girl didn't quite understand his reaction. Naruhito exclaimed that this was the very same reincarnation popular in 2020. The girl noted that she hadn't expected such overwhelming joy. Naruhito loudly expressed his happiness, a smile never leaving his face. The girl found it very interesting. The guy asked her to tell him everything she thought. He was glad he hadn't died, but had simply ended up in another world. He mentioned adventurers, lizards, and Lazar. He also talked about various animals. The hero asked if all this really existed in another world and moved closer to the girl. She asked him to move away, pointing out his injuries, although he probably didn't realize it. The young man cried out with joy that his wish had come true and he had found himself in another world. He decided to take a good look around this place and looked around. The girl turned to Mars. She declared that this was the otaku in question. Naruhito exclaimed that he'd been a bit into it as a child, but nothing more. The girl remarked that he was becoming more and more surprising. She listened to his voice and asked what exactly he'd said. The boy explained that he wasn't an otaku. The girl thought about the lizard and other creatures. She asked how he knew Lazar. The boy explained that they were placed together in the same servant carriage. The girl froze, unable to answer. Naruhito asked if she had anything to do with the incident. He looked very serious and stern. Van Verbana noticed that the boy changed in a second, as if he had two personalities. She clapped her hand. She explained that he wouldn't be able to kill Wind with blades. In her opinion, he shouldn't have acted so rashly. The Wind was no friend to the bandits he spoke of. The girl decided that she simply remembered it. She thought about the main character and Lazarus, pondering what was happening. Naruhito didn't understand anything and explained that he knew little about the girl, while she seemed to know too much about him. He frowned, not understanding why. When asked if he meant to say he'd use force if she didn't tell him, she remarked that this expression suited him very well, and Vetra liked it. The guy asked her to ask one question, and I felt an unpleasant feeling. He couldn't imagine killing this girl. Perhaps it wasn't worth it. He decided he needed to change the subject. The protagonist asked why she called herself Wind. He found it presumptuous. The girl concentrated and asked the protagonist to shut up. He became frightened and recoiled. Suddenly, she turned to Mars, saying that they were very similar. The protagonist froze, unable to understand anything. Van explained that this expression reminded her of a certain atmosphere. The young man looked questioningly at the girl. She asked where his uniform was and remarked on his poor taste. He explained that she was being picky. He hadn't had any clothes on at first, but he woke up wearing what he was wearing. The fire had burned out. Van stretched, rose from her chair, and explained that he wouldn't be able to live peacefully. She was going to let him out of this place now. He replied that she was very nice, and he was fine with it. They locked eyes and held each other's gaze. Van smiled. She'd taken in everything she'd seen. She'd concluded that Wind didn't like Naruhito after all. The girl mentioned a thick fog that appeared before her eyes. She also recalled an adventurer with the power to take over the world. Ven asked the hero to live for himself, assuring him that she would not forget him and that she would make the right choice. The young man asked what was going on. The girl reminded him of his subsequent visit to the guild and informed him that he would not be able to use the dragon seal. The protagonist understood what she was talking about. He remembered the armored dragon saying something similar. Wen explained that being an otaku wouldn't work either. The protagonist's expression hardened. The girl reminded him that she was very afraid of change. She explained that she would let him out of here. She declared that he wouldn't survive in the tower now. The hero had to live in the city, or more precisely, in the capital. Their meeting had to be secret. Otherwise, the girl would always be worried. Everything had to remain confidential. The young man began to think. A wind began to engulf him, and he began to disappear. Naruhito began teleporting. The girl explained that she would send him away with one jerk and seal his memory. The protagonist didn't understand what was happening. He started shouting denials and begging for it to stop, claiming it would harm him as he'd had a similar experience before. The girl expressed admiration, calling it terrifying. But she said the guy definitely needed to try. Naruhito continued to teleport through the wind. She hoped to meet again someday, and that next time it wouldn't be her that was carried by the wind. That was the hope she held as the boy was carried further and further by the whirlwind. The elf, as he was leaving, asked him to say hello to the guys from the guild and those dragons. He also warned the young man to be careful with anemia, as it would be hard for him to be food for vampires and a threat for dragons. The guy also remembered Lazar, whose baked goods she would no longer be able to try. The elf had to stay alert with the crows, even though it was supposed to be difficult, but he was counting on Toyama Naruhito being able to kill the wind. After all, everything happened according to his wishes. The guy said goodbye to him again, this time for good. For her, the young man was a deep, heavy fog that shrouded her destiny. He was the man the dragon had given him, troublesome yet beautiful. He wished this adventurer well. Soon the young man disappeared into the wind funnel, after which the elf sat down heavily on the chair. As he said, there was no longer any point in paying attention to this. The boy was a dangerous man. In times past, the wind had taken control of the entire world. With its power, one could reach God, and maybe even an angel. But the wind couldn't resist the man, for he had a very strong will. He wasn't going to stop until he got his way. The elf glanced at his palm and reflected bitterly on his failure, but that wasn't a problem. In any case, the wind would remain wind, and Venfarbana would remain Verfinbana. What the man did next was his business, and they would begin their own story. Each of them had their own path to follow. A month had passed since the wanted poster for Toyama, and it was time to continue survival. The hidden quest had been unlocked, and now, recalling the conversation with Venfarbana, there was a chance to meet her, a high-level adventurer. Exiting Hater Tower determined the goal had been optionally achieved, followed by 10 memory cleansings, after which Venfarbana's spirit was accepted. The Adventurers Guild was a real crowd. Everyone was pushing and shoving, trying to squeeze closer. The girl asked him several times not to push her, but her request was not heard. This finally drove her crazy, and she threw the man over herself. The man looked at the task board and gloomily noted that there was nothing good left. While everyone was chatting among themselves, the wind snatched the sheet from the adventurer's hands. A whirlwind swirled around the room, and the girl held up her skirt and screamed, "Whose skill could it be?" Suddenly, a man fell to the floor, cursing furiously. Rising from the floor, he immediately began scolding the elf, but soon noticed everyone staring at him. He was mistaken for a black-haired servant because of the iron cuffs. Meanwhile, the boy was trying to figure out where he was. To the humans, the stranger appeared to be the one the dragon was looking for. The beast woman trembled as she looked at him, and the young man noticed her cat ears. The adventurers decided that the young man had recently caused a disturbance and that the entire empire was looking for him. 10,000 gold coins were offered for his capture, and since he had managed to slay the dragon, some thought it best to leave the youth alone. Upon hearing the price offered, Toyama pouted. In his opinion, he was worth more. The empire could have offered as much as 400 million. The guy didn't give the impression of being strong and scary because he was dressed very sloppily. The adventurers were debating their course of action when one of them expressed his intention to leave the guild. The hero liked the idea. Then he crossed his legs and thought about what he needed to do next. Suddenly, the beast girl began screaming for the boy to be killed immediately, as it was because of him that her older sister had died. The loud noise made Toyama cover his ears with his fingers. She even offered money for the fulfillment of her request. She just needed his death. The cat insisted until a strange man appeared, who found the whole situation interesting. It turned out to be Alice, a dragon that lives in those places. She was delighted that someone had dared to defy her orders, even though the entire empire had heard it. Apparently, he wasn't human at all. A threatening expression appeared on the girl's face. She had already spoken about the need to find this guy, but now she heard as if some girl had her own opinion on this matter. The priestess asked the beast woman to answer something in her defense, but she only fell down from fear. The girl turned her attention to the young man and said she had been looking for him. Toyama was unnerved by her interest. Suddenly, she began to tell him that every night since that very day, the wound he inflicted, the fear he inspired, the heart he pierced, had torn through her. Those were sad, lonely nights. The boy didn't understand what she was talking about. The girl called Toyama to follow her. She wanted to talk to him about many things. However, the young man reacted tensely and warned the stranger not to come any closer. He decided that the stranger had not noticed anything, but she immediately realized that she was in the affected area. However, the woman had already had to go through such a lesson, and the young man had already used his current attack on her before. The hero didn't expect her to know everything. The woman noticed the confusion on his face and asked him not to be afraid. They would sort everything out later. He became curious about how the girl had managed to stop the blades, and how she had finally learned the name of the fighting style. However, it was obvious, since he had once managed to kill her. Toyama had done all this in the past. It was a good experience for the woman, and the guy turned out to be an excellent hunter. The young man frowned in displeasure. He'd had to put a lot of effort into that last blow. However, the girl clarified that it had indeed worked and decided to show off her scar. The hero did not believe in the seriousness of the words. However, no matter what, she wanted to meet him, the man who had conquered the dragon and her killer, and also the most wonderful opportunity in her life. He was surprised again. Then Alice realized that it was not typical for people to speak like that and corrected herself, clarifying that she had come for him, her man. The hero became increasingly astonished by his lack of understanding of what was happening. Meanwhile, Alice thought for a moment and came to the conclusion that he shouldn't have remained a servant. Then she clapped her hands and called her grandfather. Almost immediately, a gray-haired man with a monocle appeared and bowed to his mistress. Alice gave the order to triple the donation to the church, as she hadn't expected things to turn out this way. Then the priestess asked for clothes for her man. The butler glanced sideways at the young man and asked if he was the one in question. The girl, smiling and cheerful, explained in detail that it was the same killer who had killed her with blades, right from the inside. The old man didn't like that it touched her body. His gaze became hard, causing the young man to back away in fear. The girl was delighted by this. The young man had managed to notice the old man's desire, which meant he was more than just a servant deprived of his freedom. Then the palace asked the name of the unknown young man. Suddenly, she folded her arms in an offended manner and muttered discontentedly about how a female could ask a male such questions. Grandfather had never seen his mistress like this before. He had long since realized that the hero had been in this business for quite some time. The boy immediately realized that this servant was dangerous. In his opinion, the young man was accustomed to fighting and spilling blood, and therefore it became clear why he had managed to kill the adventurer. For him, Toyama was worse than a monster. Alice placed her hand on the servant's shoulders and pointed out that the boy had already realized how cool he was. Besides, she'd already said he was quite an interesting man. The butler agreed. In that case, the grandfather had the idea of asking the hero for a favor. Toyama sarcastically realized that he had no choice, so it was worth a try. Suddenly, the young man rose from the floor. He finally realized that the guy in armor he had killed was alive, and he turned out to be such a beauty. The sheer volume of information made him dizzy, so he asked to be left alone for a while. But in his mind, he cherished the hope of escape. The girl readily agreed to let him get some fresh air, but the old man immediately warned her that the young man would try to escape. The old servant saw in him the habits of a real man. The mistress was horrified by his guess. She began shaking things up in a rage and complaining about how she'd made so many preparations and dressed up, yet her man still wanted to run away. Toyama, watching from the sidelines, decided the girl had completely lost her mind. However, he was interested in something entirely different: why she was still alive. The old man was finally convinced that the young man was not one of them. Dragons had 7 lives, and their duty was to leave a strong seed offspring with anyone who could defeat them in life. In kingdoms and empires, this was the first thing to be taught. The hero decided to make a point of visiting the library. The grandfather recognized the young man as an interesting person, and he was also attracted to his unsystematic skills. The boy sensed that something bad was brewing. The priestess noticed the change and asked what had happened. The old man explained that her man was confused and that would cause trouble. Apparently, they will have to take it by force. Now the goal of the young man's quest was to escape from the guild, and the goal to complete it became to defeat the dragon and his service. The guy cursed. It was easier said than done. Alice asked the servant not to hurt the young man too much, since he was already hers. Toyama expected the girl to be angry and said her character and manners remained the same, but she only smiled. If an ordinary person had said that to her, she'd probably be angry by now, but in the current situation, her heart sank. Besides, what was on the guy's tongue was what was on his heart. It was all the same. The dragon covered her flushed face. She felt pain, but she also felt pleasure. The hero wondered why the girl was laughing and not angry. Was it really impossible to defeat her? The grandfather understood the hero's silent question and explained that his mistress liked it when people spoke without hidden meanings. After all, the dragon could see into people's hearts. The man folded his hands behind his back and asked one last time if Toyama would go with them. But the hero grinned. He'd been told since childhood not to go with strangers. The old man rushed forward and struck the boy, but he managed to block it. The butler praised the young man's reflexes. He was even beginning to like it. The boy, for his part, was surprised by the servant's incredible speed. At that moment, something unexpected happened. The butler seemed to vanish from his spot, and the young man only managed to hear him say that he'd hit the mark this time. They managed to figure it out quickly. The quest to defeat the servant had failed, followed by the disappearance of the route. The owner of the territory and the guildmaster came to them in response to the noise. They asked the dragon and the butler what it all meant. The girl explained to them that they had found what they were looking for and were now returning home. The announcement from the dragon embassy was due to begin soon, and the priestess had given them permission to come in and watch. The girl dropped to one knee and apologized to the dragon for the trouble he had caused. She made a promise to get rid of those adventurers who were lying unconscious. Alice bit her finger and calmed her down quite a bit by saying that she was in a good mood. Then she asked why there was such a big difference in the adventurers. The girl thanked him for the comment and promised to take immediate action. The girl admitted that she was mistaken about people, because the owner of the territory turned out to be a straightforward and interesting person, as well as the guy who killed her. In her opinion, these children of change weren't so boring. Then she hinted to them that it was time to leave, asking to see them again in a little while on the notice. The servant picked up Toyama and called his mistress to set off, intending to carry the young man. But the girl intended to do it herself. However, her entire face was red, so the old man asked if she would even be able to touch the hero. The guildmaster and the territory owner listened to their argument in surprise. The man asked Marie what was going on, considering that the dragon itself, the supreme being, was standing before them. While the servant and his mistress were trying to figure out who would be best to carry the unconscious boy's body. The master drooped and asked permission to skip the upcoming meeting, despite the dragon's good mood. But Marie believed that this time, slipping away wouldn't be possible and she'd have to go. While unconscious, the young man saw himself as a child, and next to him was a dog. Taro was his first friend. When the dog barked, the boy didn't understand what it was trying to tell him. Then Taro ran up and drove towards his owner, knocking him off his feet. Even if the world these two lived in was different for them, they were still able to be friends. The boy taught the dog commands, and if successful, he praised and hugged his friend. He even shared his troubles with him, telling him how he was being attacked again, calling him strange. Hearing this, Taro pulled away, then unexpectedly licked Toyama's nose. The boy was surprised at first, but then began to laugh, thereby embarrassing the dog. The dog barked merrily while the hero continued to sit on the ground. After some thought, the young man suggested that his friends travel together. Just the two of them. He wanted to start as soon as possible, because if Toyama and Taro were together, they became invincible. The boy petted the dog and said that would be his promise. Soon it was time for the hero to return home, otherwise he risked being punished for being late. He waved to the dog and told him to wait. After he left, Taro climbed back into the booth and wanted to sleep, but heard approaching footsteps. Approached him, one of them was unhappy to see the dog, after which he angrily kicked Taro with his foot. They tried to chase the dog away, amused by how it trembled. At that moment, the dog was in pain and fear. His gnome was destroyed, but Toyama's promise was still in his memory. They continued to beat Taro, but soon they got tired of it. Much to the dog's misfortune, a gang of guys decided to kill him. One of them picked up the dog, cursing at how dirty he was. Then they threw Taro into the water, but even there, the dog continued to think about how he couldn't sew his place with Naruhito. He knew the boy would be sad when he couldn't see him again. The pain and fear Taro had felt at his death's hour were not as terrible to him as his friend's grief. The dog was sad that they would never see each other again. An unknown voice echoed in the darkness of the dog's mind, and he was surprised. There, beyond the celestial plains, beyond the stars, he had managed to see something unusual. There was something about this dog that drew him. The voice sensed the animal's indignation and considered it fitting. After all, that Alice had taken everything from him, and Taro could have become his successor. Suddenly, the dog realized he had heard someone. Apparently, Naruhito had already come to visit his friend. However, when he arrived, he didn't find his friend, only a gathering of vandals. The dog was still lamenting and silently apologizing for not being able to keep his promise. The young man asked the boys if they had seen the dog. They merely pointed silently at the water. The beast continued to think, sinking deeper and deeper, that there was still something he could do. The guys explained to him that the dog was bothering them, so they decided to wash it off. Upon learning of this, the boy's only thought was to kill the ringleaders. But his friend seemed to hear this and begged him not to, as he had neither fangs nor claws. So he intended to become one himself. The voice asked its successor if he knew there was a name for these fangs and claws. The dog furiously begged the white, fog-like thing to shut up. The beast exceeded the creature's expectations, but now at least it had a name. This technique, with its claws and fangs, was associated with the fog. It was called blades. The owner of the mysterious voice watched him through the fog and intended to save him someday, so that the dog doesn't have to cry anymore and can get everything he wants. The boy petted the dog and suggested they continue their journey. Tears began to flow from Toyama's eyes. He came to, feeling shattered. He hadn't had this dream in a long time. Then he noticed a strange sound and realized there was a girl lying next to him on the bed. She was talking about something in her sleep and was rolling around on the bed, far from the hero. Then he noticed how huge the bed was, and it was unclear who could have made it. However, he then noticed that everything around him was large, which seemed quite unusual. The young man climbed out of bed and, as he left, thanked the woman for the night's lodging. He left the room with a thoughtful expression, trying to decide what to do next. But then, to his surprise, the butler appeared and greeted him. The young man asked his grandfather where he'd come from, but it turned out he'd been there all along. Then the servant decided to ask him something too. He narrowed his eyes and asked where the guest was headed. The hero began to stutter, unsure of what to say in response. Then he pretended to think about it and replied that, in fact, he had no plans to go anywhere. The old man sighed for his lost youth, looking at this young man. He then suggested that Toyama go change clothes, and then do something else. The next moment, he waved his hand. The iron shackles fell to the floor. They were no longer needed, and they didn't look particularly secure. The hero tried to figure out how the butler had managed to cut through the iron. The old man straightened his tie and announced that he was going to the lady and called Farron. He ordered the maids to take care of the guest, and 3 girls led the boy away in an unknown direction. He then went to wake his mistress. After some time, the grandfather realized the maid's help was unnecessary, and the young man explained that he was a community worker. The butler decided to ask if he had already served anyone. The girls were upset that they hadn't had the chance to help the man the mistress herself had recognized, as they had wanted to take care of him. The senior servant had many questions for the young man, but there was no time for answers. They entered the Dragon Hall, a sacred place where important events took place. All the well-groomed people were already in place, and the guy even got scared, thinking it was the boss's room. The butler overheard this and asked the guests not to be so nervous. The hall was simply enormous, with several seats and a high stage. The girl was delighted when she saw her man appear. The hero was invited to sit right in the center. The young man looked rather unfriendly. The angel lady found the boy's black hair and brown eyes quite unusual. The guildmaster, sitting next to him, quietly prayed that nothing dangerous would happen. But Mari didn't support him. She had a bad feeling about this. Everyone was discussing the boy, mistaking him for a dragon priest. Toyama's frown deepened as the numerous averted glances fell upon him. The girl asked Spy if she'd seen anything, but she replied that nothing special had happened. Only the young man sitting next to her noticed the first-class clothing. The hostess of the meeting sat menacingly in the most honorable place. The hall was filled with the best of the people, the men who defended her fierce city. Among them were Master of the Merchant Guild, Spinamoro, Margrave Sapanvontici, Master of the Adventurers Guild, Haida Marie Snaberia, present to the Church of the Angels, Bishop Canosa Theofjord, and also from there was the main saint Svi Dakmashar and the Knight of the Church of Angels, quarters of the 10 Knights, Crane of Adasta. The dragon apologized for the disturbance she had caused in the guild. Haida Marie thanked her for her sincerity and promised to execute anyone who dared to discredit her words. This also took into account what the guild could expect, and the lady acknowledged Marie was reasonable. However, the dragon was in a good mood, and she asked to bring one cat. She wanted to be invited into the hall for a little hunt, but the young man winced in disgust and cruelty. But Snaberia herself intended to arrange it immediately. Alice clarified that, as a dragon, she could not help but take advantage of the opportunity, and an idea came to her mind again. If the beastman girl had a whole family, then she could bring them all. The dragon intended to make them her playthings. At these words, everyone present broke out in a cold sweat from the tension. Marie knew that they could not disobey this creature's order. The lady waved her hand and sent the girl off to fulfill her wish. But suddenly the hero's voice rang out, asking about the family, which meant there might have been dogs there. The guests were completely unprepared for such actions from this young man. Everyone's faces were frozen in silent expressions of shock and hostility. In response to his question, Alice explained that both would become food. The young man didn't care about the cat, but he didn't want to let the dogs be harmed. At that moment, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, and the church representative immediately realized he was dead. Confusion briefly appeared on the dragon's face. Then she good-naturedly agreed to his terms and told the guildmaster to bring only one cat. No one expected such compliance from such a formidable woman. The dragon noticed Marie's strange look and asked what was wrong with her face. The girl quickly apologized deeply and thanked her for her words. The man asked the guildmaster who the young man was. The girl believed he was one of the dragons. The knight was seething with anger. He stood up from his place and loudly addressed the guy with an unpleasant expression. The young man turned in his direction, displeased, to find out what the problem was. The man was annoyed that the hero had sat silently and listened the entire time. Her indignation stemmed from the fact that he assumed Toyama didn't understand who he was standing before. After all, this was the great priestess, the dragon guarding the empire. Normally, the young man would have been gone by now. That's why the knight was so infuriated by his behavior. The hero was surprised by his words. He had no idea of the seriousness of it. He raised his hands in a gesture of truce and addressed Crane quite frivolously, asking him to take his hands off the sword. The young man began to tease the knight, not believing he was seriously prepared to oppose him. He even suggested that the man considered showing off his sword to everyone a hobby. Crane finally lost his temper and screamed loudly, but was immediately restrained. The priestess of the moment attacked the violator of order, spewing flames at him, because it was her job to decide with whom and how to behave. She pursed her lips and concluded that she was speaking to her man. The saint exhaled heavily. Because of the holy knight's temperament, she hadn't wanted to take him with her. Then she turned to the great dragon. Canosa tried to justify Adasta, saying that he himself did not realize his situation. The girl begged the priestess for forgiveness. At that moment, the dragon remembered that the saint's prophecy about meeting her man had come true. So Alice calmed down and forgave Crane. The hero looked at the charred body and realized the man was still alive. Teal Ford explained to the dragon that Adost was one of the 10 knights. Alice laughed. She finally understood why this man had such bad luck. She wanted to crush him to dust, but she still gave the order to cure Cran. The saint was very grateful to the priestess for her understanding and turned to Svei. She immediately understood everything and began healing. She used the healer's hand system and then passed her hand with the magical liquid over the mutilated body. The dragon was surprised that Svei turned out to be a saint and acknowledged her stylish magic. Dakmashar was grateful for the priestess's praise, but remained modest, as it wasn't worth it. Then she turned to the knight and angrily explained to him that he remained alive only thanks to the great dragon and their mistress. However, if the man failed to understand this, Svei threatened to kill him herself. The hero turned away from the body, wishing Crane wouldn't look at him. When the knight returned to his place, the priestess finally decided to tell why she had called everyone to the meeting. The reason was the dark-haired human servant who had managed to kill her. For this reason, the guy was forgiven for sitting right in front of her, contradicting her, and expressing his opinion. She was willing to let him treat her as an equal. The knight must have misunderstood everything, as if a man was deceiving her. The dragon rose from her throne and spread her arms grandly. Now the one to whom everything was forgiven had appeared, namely, her killer. She hoped that her feelings had reached all the guests at the meeting, and from now on it was announced that Toyama had become her partner. Alice addressed her fellows. An empire worthy of worship. She would marry the hero, and their bond would last forever. Now it was no longer just a dragon festival, but a wedding. Marie remarked that it would be quite a hassle. A man nearby asked her for some stomach medicine, as he was starting to feel a tummy ache from all the excitement. The priestess understood the guests' confusion and asked if any of the members of the alliance objected. Those who objected were to understand the hand. If there were none, they were to confirm their agreement with silence. Alice was pleased that another treaty had been made between dragons and humans. She then explained that for a dragon, bonding with its slayer is a true desire. Now she, too, had a chance to find happiness. The young man was about to object to her, but his speech was interrupted. Marie rose from her seat and volunteered to organize the priestess's wedding. She would like to hold a celebratory battle in the arena during the Dragon Festival. Alice bit her lip with joy at such an offer. She wanted to see the battle between the guys from the tower and the ancients, because they were not boring. The girl was ready to prepare everything. Sapan, however, intended to notify the entire empire. But he himself was sure that the emperor regretted that he would not be able to attend the celebration. Alice was not upset by this, because Von Tichy was a good replacement for him. The man began to admire the priestess's generosity. The people interpreted it as charity on her part. The dragon thought this was a good option, but rumor had it could affect trade. However, she still left the matter to Tichy to exercise his authority. Then another guest came out. The girl suggested, at the expense of the Merchants' Guild, reducing wages at rental shops. Then, order all merchants to prepare the goods needed for the holiday. Alice found her proposal too weak and challenged the girl to come up with more ideas. If all of them turned out to be boring, the priestess would destroy all her trade routes. She bowed again and promised to do her best, and the priestess replied that she was relying on her. The bishop was the next to speak. Canossa meant. She assumed the saint believed she should have killed her. The dragon admired such bravery. The priestess relied on her prophecy and courage. Canossa, however, was glad for the woman's existence. Afterwards, she asked the bishop what she thought about the holiday. The saint suggested setting the table and reducing the price of angel powder. She also intended to rehearse a song about glorifying the dragon with the choir. The priestess accepted her idea and gave her time to perform it before the dragon festival. The relationship between humans and dragons has been forged since ancient times. The dragon race found from above, and humans from below. This concept was imprinted on the souls of humanity. However, everyone there forgot one important thing. The priestess was glad to be free of her boring cave. She'd been waiting for this day for 100 years. Then Alice looked at the seated hero and felt even more pleased, for she had the best of the best. But everyone had forgotten the most important thing. Even the dragons were oblivious to one very significant moment. Marriage had to be consensual. Toyama began to brush his hands. As if shooing away an insect, he wanted to remain single for a while longer, so he declared his refusal to marry. Dragons were isolated creatures, superior beings, forbidden to be touched by humans. These monsters lived under a different law. To be chosen by the dragon meant that the chosen partner would receive all the love in the world. Humans weren't allowed to even stand near dragons, so they made themselves known to these creatures above all else. Dragons are sacred beings. That phrase was deeply ingrained in humanity's souls. Despite all these conditions, there was still a person who refused such an alliance. The priestess seemed struck by lightning in surprise and cried out questioningly. The hero explained that this was his exact phrase. He assumed there had been some kind of mistake and couldn't understand why things were turning out this way. Alice reminded him of her origins, but even that had no effect, causing the priestess to faint. The servant held his mistress while she began to recollect her strange dream. Now her premarital doubts became clear. However, the old man explained that it had all been real. The girl reminded herself again that she was a dragon, but was still refused. The butler confirmed everything. After that, she turned to the hero. The priestess began to look menacing, believing the young man had misunderstood his situation. The guests began to howl in fear when they saw her like this. A servant approached the young man and asked if he even understood what a wedding with a dragon entailed. The young man asked the old man again, and he explained that this gave free rein to all his desires. Since the young man was one of the people, he too had his own dreams. People did everything to achieve their goals. They literally lived for it, no matter how harsh such a verdict might sound. Toyama didn't deny the obvious. The old man continued. Then the hero must have realized that by linking his destiny with the dragon, all his dreams would come true, without any limitations. This gave the young man food for thought. After all, there was a right to choose, and at that moment the hero was the luckiest person. The words about Toyama being able to teach him anything he wanted made him remember the promise he made to the dog to go on a journey with him. He also wanted to build his own bakery near the lake. A malicious smile appeared on his face. Apparently everyone around him thought he was stupid. The smile turned into laughter. The guy decided to use a metaphor and gave the example of the most interesting day that came before the weekend. The speech skill test began, testing successful resistance to the arrow prompts. All the conditions for this were met. Then Toyama explained that the most interesting thing in games is the level not reached. What was interesting was when the character explored various paths to achieving this. The butler didn't understand what the young man was getting at. However, the hero continued to ramble on. He managed to understand once again that the most interesting aspect of desire and aspiration was the attempt to achieve it. Thanks to this, the young man developed a new ability, debate, thanks to which Toyama Naruhito could resist words. The guy, with a satisfied and slightly crazy smile, confirmed to himself that he would build a house on the shore of the lake. But this required money, as well as studying the economy of a given country. The hero needed to start working and learn about the world around him. He covered his face with his hand again and acknowledged the irony of the situation, because he only wanted one thing. However, many things stood in his way. Now his interest was growing. This was his path to what he wanted. Naruhito understood that he would have to put in more effort, that he would have to face difficulties and trials along the way, and that the joy of achieving results was all completely his own. He told the dragon that he would not give them anything, and he did not need anything from them. He didn't care at all what others might give him. The debate skill kicked in. The goal was to convince the dragon. All possible unfavorable outcomes resulting from a less-than-friendly relationship were taken into account. He repeated once again, to reinforce, that he did not need anything from the dragon and the servant, and therefore they should not touch what belonged to him. An ominous aura appeared around them, and fog began to envelop the priestess and the old man, but she dispersed it with her hand, saying she had remembered everything. However, the fog was thicker than before. Grandfather thoughtfully wiped a little blood from the corner of his lips. He could see that there was something terrible inside Toyama. The boy threateningly warned them to let him go, and it was up to him, not them. While they were talking, the persuasion kicked in, and then the opportunity arose to use the blades. No one but Naruhito himself dared to take away his freedom. The guests watched this situation in horror. It felt like a nightmare. The man began to threaten the dragon. The hero had much to do, so he chased the butler out of his way and asked the dragon to leave him alone. A debate ensued. The hero resorted to blackmail, and the dragon-slaying technique was activated. The old man's expression also changed, and he noticed that life was definitely boiling in this young man. The hero continued to chase his grandfather out of the way, as he had no hobby of bullying older people. These words offended the butler. For the boy, it was a gamble. He was sure that there would be a continuation. The time was coming for new games, the fulfillment of desires, and from now on, the young man was going to act at his own discretion. Even if he encounters danger, or even dies, he will continue on his way. The man became completely enraged and shouted that these were the hero's last words. Toyama grinned. Finally, his grandfather had revealed his true colors. He'd made a joke about his forgotten manners, but the butler had merely dismissed the boy as a young fool. A fight was about to begin between them. The fog was increasingly enveloping the opponents. The priestess stood silently to the side, barely holding back tears of resentment. The debate had been a success, but the dragon was dejected. She was upset that Toyama so vehemently refused to be with her. Her question distracted the rivals from each other. Naruhito thought for a moment and then said that he simply didn't like her. Previously, she tried to kill the lizard and acted important, but the young man did not like this. The priestess repeated his words, and the hero confirmed them once again. The next moment, burning tears gushed from the woman's eyes, and she even asked again if it was true. Suddenly, she began to apologize for her wrongdoing. The butler was completely shocked by his mistress's reaction. Then she decided to go and rest, and ordered the hero to be taken back to the city, but carefully. The old man asked if the priestess was sure. The dragon wiped her nose and replied, because she had been told outright that she was not liked, and Alice did not want to hear anything like that anymore. Suddenly, 2 dragon wings grew out of her back. The girl flapped her wings into the air and flew away. She raced at breakneck speed, the butler trying to call out to her to wait. Then the man instructed Farron to follow orders, and the maid understood. The old man himself decided to follow the priestess. He followed her example and soared into the air at high speed. Those around were shocked, and the maids admired the young man who was able to bring his mistress to tears. He was definitely suitable for the role of the groom. Marie and Von Ticci lamented that they, too, had to learn Japanese. Alice flew higher and higher, her mind spinning with thoughts of being told she wasn't loved, and yet she was a dragon. She believed that everything should belong to her, and the choice was always there for her. The priestess could not understand why the hero was contradicting her. She was worried about why he denied her words. Alice could not forgive this. She begged her heart to hate Toyama, to never forgive him. Her eyes lit up with a thirst for revenge. The girl was on the verge of breaking down. She recalled the butler's words about how people constantly lied and were so easy to read. They were always afraid of the direction of her fire. Many openly said the priestess was interfering with them. The hero turned out to be the same. He hated her and said it straight to her face. That same dragon slayer. She pulled her knees up to her chest and thought hard about what had happened. The priestess realized with bitterness that the young man did not belong to her. From now on, she was hated, and she had no idea what to do next. She was distracted from her thoughts by the butler. It was the first time the man had seen his mistress in such a state. The grandfather called the lady to come back. She couldn't run away from the guy for long. The girl was silent for a while, and then said that she didn't want that. She shivered, as if from the cold, when she realized she had angered him. Alice didn't want to feel that way again. Even though she was a dragon, she didn't understand the reasons. After all, the girl could only hold on to what she wanted by force. The old man listened to the girl's thoughts, and decided to tell her that there was a way to understand each other's souls, even without consummating the marriage. After all, the priestess was closer to people than all the other dragons. The priestess had managed to meet her killer, and she experienced mixed feelings. However, Alice would soon pass through this stage and grow up. Then, she would be able to find the answers to her question. Toyama's words, when he said he hated her, came back to the priestess. And yet, she couldn't accept it. Tears streamed down her cheeks again. She couldn't overcome the hurt from those words. The old man cupped her face in his hands and asked her to raise her head. He didn't believe that the lady really thought so. Could the dragon really not resist a man? Where did the pride of the priestess, the highest being, go? The old man looked at her with pity in his eyes, which began to anger the girl. How dare he even allow such a thing? The man smiled at her reaction. To him, in this situation, she looked like a little girl. Could this girl really have been so capable of cowering in a corner after just one harsh word from a man? Her grandfather had completely driven her crazy, and the dragon began to transform. She charged at the old man, screaming furiously that she would finish him off. The priestess was an ancient and powerful being, undecipherable by either her mind or her movements. There was no one stronger in the world. Suddenly the butler grabbed her clawed hand and broke it. For him, her actions were slow. The priestess scolded him, because how could an ordinary butler dare raise his hand against his mistress? However, he explained that his mistress was not one to give up so easily. The man then asked again if she was sure of her decision, and the girl again sadly lowered her head. The old man didn't know how many attempts she would have to make, but he was ready to repeat the words that it was time for her to grow up again and again. He extended his hand to her. It was time for her to choose whether she would remain alone like the other dragons, or a different path. The girl tried to silence him, because when the hero spoke of his hatred towards her, he wasn't lying. So she'd had enough. She started screaming that she was no longer herself, and that she didn't need these terrible feelings. Grandfather touched her cheek again. Even though Alice said such things, there was still a way out. These sufferings and hardships were purely her own feelings. The priestess needed to accept them as part of herself, just like her arrogance, greed, and nobility. The man was pressuring her to reveal what she truly wanted to do with the Dragon Slayer, what her true desire was. The girl answered without hesitation. She wanted to be friends with him. She had done many wonderful things to him. Because of misunderstandings and her clingy attitude, Toyama was able to hate her. But the priestess wanted to talk to him, to get to know him better. She also wanted him to call her by her first name, even if it sounded awkward. Alice didn't want to back down and asked her faithful servant what she should do. This time, the grandfather praised his mistress for her excellent perspective. She might have suffered a defeat, but nothing was over yet. And to achieve what she desired, she needed only one thing: get up and move forward. This was the dragon's first test adventure. The girl didn't understand what the butler meant. The old man wanted her to pull herself together and start growing up and learning. No matter what difficulties she might face, he wanted the lady to always move forward. If she still wanted to gather all the dragons together, then she shouldn't have lied to herself. And then the time will come to finish off that dragon slayer. Only by following this path would she be able to heal her emptiness and escape her boredom. While they were talking, the broken bone in her arm healed. That's why people went on various adventures, and she was the dragon closest to them. In the butler's opinion, the dragon collector simply had to see all the beauty in the world. Then he asked what landscapes she desired to encounter along her journey. At that moment, the sun began to rise on the planet, and the bright light of a huge star illuminated the faces of the two beings. Then the girl clearly understood that she would like to enjoy this beauty together with the hero. Now she has definitely decided to finish him off and then show off this enchanting look. She apologized to the old man for making him worry. This was her first adventure, and although she was scared, the priestess was now ready to eagerly await the right moment. The butler bowed to her and explained that that was precisely why she was called the Dragon Collector. Soon it was time to return, but excitement flared within the girl again. The grandfather asked her to rely on him, as he was ready to support her in this adventure. Even if he had to put his life on the line, the man would protect her at any cost. The priestess snorted in displeasure, saying that this was definitely not to be allowed. Suddenly, the old man remembered an old saying that had existed long before the Great War, which had come to them from the Second Civilization. He told the girl to take advantage of the naked date next time, as the old saying went. Alice was confused and assumed the servant didn't understand what he was talking about. The butler pretended not to hear her and reminded her of the need to go back. The girl still couldn't grasp the meaning of this proverb and wanted a more detailed explanation. Meanwhile, Naruhito was relaxing in the hot pool. He came to kill the priestess, but ended up taking a bath in her house. Alice fled, and her servant simply brought him back and left him there. Then he remembered the notification that the debate had been successful and the dragon was in a depressed state. The hero did not understand what he could have said. That made the priestess start crying. Crying was against the rules. He tried to shake these thoughts off and began to shake his head, convincing himself that he had done nothing wrong. The best solution for the hero was to simply enjoy the warm water and deal with everything else later. Another man entered the bathroom and asked the young man if the water was good. Toyama was so relaxed with pleasure that he agreed without a second thought, especially since the high temperature made him drowsy. The butler was pleased to hear this, but it would have been better if Naruhito hadn't fallen asleep right there. The boy saw who stood before him and covered his face with his hand in indignation. Then the hero asked how long the old man had been there. The man replied that the maids had brought him there as well. The young man was beginning to get annoyed that his question had been ignored, so he repeated it again. Grandfather gave another vague answer. Butlers also liked to take hot baths. The boy began to wonder if this man had been there all along. Toyama decided to ask how his mistress was faring. The man asked him not to worry about it, he reassured her, and then went off to rest. Soon, the butler himself began to feel sleepy. He suddenly called the hero a strange man, because he was sitting calmly next to the man who had tried to kill him. It was surprising that the boy didn't feel fear. However, the young man hadn't even known that his grandfather had made such attempts. Toyama wasn't afraid, but he didn't feel calm. Besides, they understood the bathroom, fighting there would be inappropriate. The hero suggested they save their squabbles for later, otherwise their squabbles might look unseemly. The butler found his wording amusing, though it sounded quite appropriate. But the boy grimaced in displeasure, unable to understand what was so funny about his words. Then Naruhito decided to find out why the girl, who was the very same dragon in armor and who died at his hand, felt sympathy for him. The old man paused, then asked where their meeting had taken place. At first, he thought it was in the Empire, but dragons were more popular in the kingdom. Toyama answered evasively, saying the meeting place was far away, and he couldn't say exactly where. The boy had no parents, so he lacked a proper education. The man was surprised to learn the young man was an orphan. Then he decided to ask him what he knew about dragons. The young man felt a thrill from the fact that someone wanted to listen to his stories, and his otaku skill automatically activated. Dragons were mythical creatures with reptilian features. In legend, their purpose was to hinder heroes, and they were also called the plagues of the heavens. The servant cut him off and explained that these creatures also had 7 lives. The young man's expression made it clear he hadn't known about this. He remembered the cats, but they had 9. The dragon's 7 lives allowed them to avoid death and live happy, long lives. These weren't magic formulas, skills, or sacraments, but a personal racial trait that ordinary humans couldn't achieve. The dragons lived for their own pleasure, not paying attention to those around them. But one day, Alice met a mortal, and it turned out to be Toyama. This young man managed to give her the cold shoulder by declaring he would never marry her. The hero explained that he didn't want to get involved with someone who could start a war at any moment. Suddenly, the butler rose from the water and bowed to the young man, apologizing for his rude treatment. The man allowed himself to attack him and threaten him, citing the fact that old age was clouding his eyes. The old man was ready to accept any punishment. The hero made him laugh, trying to make him raise his head. After all, he had no intention of making fun of the elderly. The butler raised his head, and a satisfied smile played on his face. He was grateful for such generosity towards him. The man grabbed the hero's hand and clarified that he had one request. The boy tried to break free, as the man's grip was too tight. The old man squeezed her even tighter and, in gratitude for her forgiveness, asked permission to make his request. He begged the young man to give his mistress another chance, although Toyama wasn't obligated to marry her. Becoming her friend was entirely possible. He'd served her for over 100 years, and had never seen her show even the slightest interest in a living being. That in itself was an incredible rarity. This meant that the priestess had finally begun to grow up, and the butler didn't want it to end like this before it had even begun. The hero found it all quite serious. The dragon's name and the concept of peace, which maintained the balance of all things. The young lady's name, however, was foreign to the other dragons. The desire to transform something into another state through the collection of love. A heart tirelessly searching for something. A balance that was managed by Mrs. the Collector. The Collector Dragon is the closest creature to humans and the one most closely connected to them. However, with the priestess's current nature, she could choose solitude, which was unacceptable for her. She needed someone who could put her in her place and guide her on the right path. Someone who could tell her how to behave, someone who would make her grow, and only Naruhito could do that. But the hero asked why the butler himself could not become such a figure for the girl. The man explained that he was only a servant, and therefore couldn't constantly contradict his mistress. But Naruhito was human and could remind her how important a connection with humanity was. The hero was no ordinary man. He refused to fulfill his desires, declaring that all hardships and the path were his alone. This was precisely what the mistress needed. Toyama responded with displeasure that the priestess was willing to stage fights for entertainment. The butler explained that dragons were cruel by nature, but he hoped that a kind boy like Naruhito could change her for the better. The man's words were akin to justification. It became clear to the hero that the girl was doing everything she could to alleviate her boredom. In this way, she reminded the hero of himself as a child. The old man considered it rude to ask such a thing of the young man. However, Toyama himself was not without his problems. He had already managed to kill a dragon once, and he was ready to do it again. Therefore, everyone was guilty in their own way. Then the boy noticed the marks on the man and begged him not to do it. But the butler was deeply impressed. Then he asked if Toyama had lied to him and if he was truly willing to give the mistress a chance. The young man honestly denied it, just so the old man would stop shaking him. Hearing this, the butler disappeared to leave them alone, and reminded the girl of the chance to improve. The hero stood there, perplexed by the old man's final words. A voice came from behind him, and the priestess explained that his grandfather had been one of the most powerful servants. He could easily disappear into the shadows and escape at super speed. For mortals, this was akin to disappearing. The boy hadn't expected such talents from him. The young man became nervous and asked who was answering him. Alice asked him not to turn around and clarified that it was she. Suddenly, the young man dove underwater. The hero was outraged by her behavior. It wasn't polite to barge into a guy's bathroom. The girl wasn't embarrassed about her body, she just didn't want to show it to Toyama. The guy said that if she didn't want to, then she should have left. She concluded that he was still angry and hated her. The guy was uneasy with her unnatural behavior. After all, she was that armored knight, Tin Can. She was unhappy with the nickname because she had a name. Then Toyama thought she'd been called something before. Then he remembered and called the priestess Alice. At that moment, she made a strange sound of surprise. The girl covered her mouth with her hands, and her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. The hero covered his face with his hands and asked what that squeak was. The girl began to defend herself. She was a grown dragon and couldn't have made anything like that. Then she calmed down and decided to change the subject. She was interested. They were talking with the butler. Toyama explained that the conversation was mostly about her. The old man wanted the hero to befriend the collector dragon. Alice began to make excuses, as if it had nothing to do with her. Then she realized that the young man should have become friends with her. The young man reminded her that he had once killed her, but she didn't attach any significance to it. She agreed that he was indeed merciless, like a certain hunter from a bedtime story. But the guy couldn't understand one thing. Right after he killed the dragon, she began to show feelings, but he wondered why. Then Alice admitted she was overwhelmed by her emotions. Naruhito was the first person to challenge her and fight her head. Immediately after her resurrection, the priestess felt an overwhelming rage, a thrill of excitement, and a sense of wonder. These feelings made her happy. Questions about why the hero had defied her and continued to resist filled her head, and this gave birth to an overwhelming desire to know everything about him. Such were Alice's wishes, but she was already completely confused. She wanted to have the young man completely, not shying away from using her power and influence. But ultimately, she was simply afraid that the hero might simply hate her. Toyama suddenly realized he was the same. If he hadn't met his friends, he could have become like this dragon. The priestess knew she sounded like she was crazy. If they were in his place, they would have done exactly the same. The hero supported Alice, saying that her feelings were normal. There was nothing wrong with wanting to be needed and surrounded by friends. Naruhito extended his hand and introduced himself. He explained that his hobbies included reading books, playing games, and spending time outdoors. He also enjoyed fishing, cooking, going to saunas, and much more. His dream was to build a house by the lake. Alice didn't understand why the guy was saying all this. The young man explained that it was an ordinary greeting, and he did it not at the butler's request, but of his own free will. The guy apologized for the fact that he could not become her husband, but friendship was quite possible. The hero was dissatisfied with his behavior and tried to straighten himself out, to act appropriately and not speak like some tsundere girl. That would have made the priestess laugh at him. Alice repeated his name and grinned. Their introduction didn't go too badly. Then the young man asked her about personal details. The girl did not understand his hints, and the hero had to explain that he wanted to know how to address her and who she was. He folded his arms in displeasure and explained that he had never heard the priestess's name come from her own lips. How could they have become friends if she couldn't even introduce herself? Alice remembered her mother telling her that, before mating, the male demanded the female say her name. The young man quickly stopped her. Then he explained that this was how people met, and that it had nothing to do with mating. He raised his hand expectantly and asked her name again. The girl timidly began to extend her hand in response. The priestess identified herself as Alice Doral. Flirtail, that was her real name. Toyama liked the name of his new dragon friend. From that moment on, they became friends. The girl repeated his request to be his friend, her expression shocked. She hid underwater in embarrassment, and the hero took it as if she didn't want to, and he had no desire to impose himself. But the girl splashed around in the water, saying that wasn't true, and she didn't mind. She smiled and said that she was only glad about it. He sighed and asked if, since they were friends now, he could just call her Alice, even though he'd never heard anyone call her that. The girl made a strange noise and, embarrassed, said it was best not to, as it made her feel incredibly awkward. She said only a select few people could call her that. The boy thought calling her a tin can in armor or a dragon collector wouldn't be such a good idea either. He remembered how he'd been asked what his nickname had been in school. Wasn't Needle really a good fit? He'd gotten angry. Then the hero decided to try something different, and suggested that the girl call her Draco. He explained that friends usually give each other nicknames, and his friends always gave him nicknames, so he thought about giving her one too. The girl quickly agreed, saying it sounded nice and that he could call her that. The girl laughed, and the guy noticed she seemed pleased. She quietly mentioned that he'd given her a nickname, and that marriage wasn't far off and it would be wonderful. The guy began to notice the water was boiling. The girl blushed, muttering her thoughts under her breath, thinking about various things. The guy yelled that she was literally heating the water with her body and called the maids. Already sitting at the table, he clicked his tongue and said that he felt like he had been boiled like a lobster. The butler said it had been a long time since the lady had felt such a fever of happiness. She said he had behaved immaturely and, as an apology, she had prepared him a delicious meal. She asked him not to be shy and to eat, since such a festive event had taken place today. Having stabbed the steak, he put it in his mouth and froze. He said it was delicious. Draco said that head-maid Farron prepared only the most exquisite dishes. He noticed that the meat was incredibly juicy, and the sauce even better. He didn't know what it was, but it was delicious, and he wondered how she did it. Farron approached and said it tasted excellent. She said that few people in this mansion truly appreciated her cooking, and she was glad he enjoyed it. He noticed she was practically beaming. She explained that she used special spices for the dish, available only in the capital. They're incredibly expensive, and by selling a couple of jars of these spices, the merchant was able to build himself a luxurious home. When Farron asked about the inflated prices and rarity, the merchant said it was because they had to ship by sea. Merchants had to fight monsters to save their cargo. The young man asked if there really was no other way to deliver. The hero thought it was incredible. The food was delicious, but the prices were so high. They had a huge bathroom, a toilet, and delicious food. He was distracted by the butler who had washed up. He couldn't help but notice the hero's education and asked where he was from. The hero said bluntly that he was born in another world and was summoned to this one. After all, here people are transported from another world as a result of some ritual. Draco called out to Naruhito and trembled. The butler hurried to tell her that they had received a report from the guild. Their guild report, where her dear friend was registered, and before becoming an adventurer, he'd suffered a severe blow to the head as a servant. Perhaps because of this, his sanity had been slightly clouded. Farron, standing behind him, sympathized with the hero and wondered what he meant by being summoned from another world. The hero thought he should be more careful with his words, or they'd think he'd lost his mind. Draco said the more important question now was where he wanted to go. He replied that he didn't know where he needed to go, but he was looking for someone. Naruhito said there were some things in his belongings, and the butler brought them to him, asking if they were what he was talking about. The hero recognized them as the necklace of return and the token he had taken from Draco, and he had given one to Lazar after killing her. Draco proudly said that he received it as a reward for killing her, so there you have it. But she couldn't understand how he got out of there. She woke up, and he was gone. He said it would be a rather strange story. After defeating her, he met a strange woman, and before he realized it, he was already transported to the guild building. And the stranger promised she wouldn't forget him. He remembered that their meetings had also been kept secret, and he couldn't remember anything else. Draco said that what was more important was that they had met in the tower and had become friends. The butler reminded his mistress to control her tale. Sitting down calmly, she said that now he needed to find the lizard. The hero asked if she was talking about Lazar and wondered if he might be somewhere in the city. The butler was about to say something, but the girl interrupted him and said that was true. In fact, she had also been looking for this lizard. The boy noticed that she spoke in the past tense. She explained that, according to the prophecy, someone else would find him, so she stopped looking. The hero asked if that meant he should keep looking. He had more important things to do. Draco said he was right. She'd used all her resources to her advantage as a dragon, but she still hadn't found him. He suggested that maybe he was already dead and his body was hidden, but the girl said not to talk nonsense. The dragons would keep their promise no matter what. She smiled, saying that this lizard was undoubtedly somewhere outside this city, and if he were dead, she would have found his body, but there were no reports of a discovery. Draco said the lizard had eluded her, but she wouldn't give up on him. The hero hesitated, and then said that finding him wouldn't be easy. At that moment, a glow appeared before his face. The hero was faced with a quest, chasing a lizard through an alley. The goal was to explore the city of Agatal, a slum. The hero told the girl he thought they could handle it. Saucers started flying overhead. The hero thanked the dragon for the hearty meal and warm bath. The girl sadly asked if he was leaving already. The boy told her not to be sad and that if he needed help, he'd come see her again. She was glad for that too. When the girl asked if he was really coming again, he said he wouldn't lie to his friends. Then the girl believed him. He said he needed to change, as walking around in a robe didn't look right, so he asked for his clothes back. The girl snapped her fingers, and the butler understood the order. Farron quickly rolled out a rack of new clothes and was told that these were the clothes of the survivors of the second-tier adventurer group, Lycans. She had bought these clothes from a merchant with whom she had discussed the tax increase. The boy noticed that the clothes were completely clean. Draco said that when she tried to find him, she discovered these clothes and asked the hero how he liked them. The butler admitted that the clothes were quite unusual. The man said the workshop boys begged him to give them the suit for study. Draco confirmed it and said she wouldn't share her treasures with those dwarves. She snapped her fingers, calling Farron over. She flashed past the hero in an instant, and he found himself dressed in new clothes in seconds. The maid advised him that his clothes would stand out, so he should take the cloak she gave him. Draco hoped he was pleased with her gift. The hero thought he looked absolutely wonderful now. She was glad he liked it. He called him by his full name, Alice Doral. Flirtel dropped to one knee in front of her. He bowed his head and thanked her. He said he'd never forget what she'd done for him, and he'd repay her kindness charmingly. She replied that it was even nice when people expressed their gratitude so sincerely, but never mind. They were friends. She said that if he was in trouble, she'd come at the first call and save him. Naruhito replied that if Draco was in trouble, he would also help in any way he could. She asked him to write her a letter when he decided on his destination so she would know where to find him, and he agreed while the servants wept. The girl ordered the old man to accompany the hero and report back on his whereabouts. The old man suggested not following the hero any longer and giving him freedom of movement. The girl asked with a smile if he had time to fall in love with her, and he, laughing, called her a tin can and asked her to shut her mouth. The servants said they would escort him and prepare a carriage. Draco said to instruct Bernard to escort Naruhito and asked if she should give him money for the journey and whether 50 platinum coins would be enough. The hero quietly asked the butler if that was a lot. He replied that for that kind of money he could build himself a mansion in the center of the capital, based on the average income. The hero was shocked. The girl took his outcry as her offer being too low, but he quickly shouted back that it was actually too much. The hero decided he'd somehow find the money himself. At that moment, an arrow appeared above the dragon's head. The system told him that, fortunately, the dragon had let down his guard and trusted him completely. She would have given all her remaining 6 lives for him. A new main quest was added, Dragon Hunt. The goal was to kill the collector's dragon. The reward was an update to the main quest, restoring the kingdom route. The Dragon Slayer skill evolves into Dragon Eater. The girl called out to the guy, who was looking at the arrow above her head with a murderous gaze and extending his hand towards her. Naruhito grabbed the arrow and crushed it, saying that he was not going to obey her. He told the hated arrow to die, pressing on to the end. A notification appeared stating that the main quest had been abandoned, and the quest line had been interrupted. The horse slowly pulled the carriage along. The hero sat in front with the butler, saying that he looked especially pleased. The old man said it was the first time in many years he'd seen the lady so content, until now. When the arrow shattered, Draco asked the hero if he'd like to stay here a little longer. He immediately replied that it was time for him to go. The girl noticed something was wrong with him and asked if everything was okay. When the hero began to deny it, saying everything was fine, she asked that once he sorted out his affairs, they would meet again, right? He took her hand and asked her to extend his little finger. She asked what it meant, and he replied that it was a promise. He didn't know how soon, but he would send her word. What he could tell her for sure was that he had no intention of leaving the city at the moment. She told him to know better than to break a promise made to a dragon, and he replied that if he had promised his friends something, he would keep it. He promised that they would meet again, not as a dragon and a mortal, or a tin can and a servant, but as friends. That was his pinky oath. She agreed and wished him luck on their next meeting. As they parted, she remembered that he had promised her this. At that moment, the butler asked the hero if he was sure 50 coppers would be enough, and he replied that it was quite enough. He couldn't ask for more. He remembered that as soon as he'd said the money would last him 3 nights in a rundown hotel, Draco's expression had turned hilarious, and he'd barely held back a laugh. The butler had laughed and announced that they were almost there. Before them was the city of adventurers, Agatal, the stronghold of the imperial capital. It is a fortress city, erected by an unknown person in the early days of the Third Civilization, Great War, before the founding of the empire. The hero noticed the towering walls and asked how they got their water. The old man explained that the city received its water from the large Nata River. The hero noticed the tower and asked what it was. The butler replied that it was an unexplored natural wonder, something no one had ever been able to decipher, the Tower of Hellel. The empire, and even many generations of people, were trying to comprehend its mysteries. The hero was mesmerized by its height, so high that even the top couldn't be seen. The old man said that the Magic Academy claimed they would never see it from above. He explained that its peak was hidden in both the human and dragon worlds, and they said that its summit connects their world and the other world, so it can't be seen from above. His friend at least believed it, while he thought it was too naive. The hero asked what was at the top of the tower, curious. The butler replied that the tales of the Church of Angels said that at the top there was everything. Their world was created by angels, and left this tower as a test for humanity. By conquering its summit, one can obtain whatever one desires, as the legends say. The hero laughed at this naive tale, and the butler agreed. The glow appeared before Naruhito again. The notification stated that the main objective had been updated, and his mission objective was now to conquer Hellel Tower. The hero hissed and said he was fed up with it. They entered the city wall, and the hero jumped out of the carriage. The butler, calling the hero a dear friend, said that if he had any problems, he should contact the dragon embassies. The hero agreed with him, and the old man said that, given his strength, there was no need to worry about him, and just in case, he decided to say that the fortress city was a huge place and was a haven for different people and races, so he should keep his ears open. The hero replied that he'd manage somehow and asked to convey his regards to the dragon collector. The butler said goodbye, asking that angels and dragons themselves protect his journey. The hero thanked the man for accompanying him, and they said goodbye. The hero entered the city, thinking that it seriously reminded him of something. He felt like he was in a fantasy game. The buildings really did resemble something similar. Many people at the market were bargaining and buying everything they needed, while the merchants were enticing customers to their goods, praising them. Looking around at the bustling life, the hero felt as if he'd arrived at a festival. He found himself at a huge fountain. He laughed, saying it felt like he'd just arrived at the starting location after the tutorial, the most fun part of the game. He sat down on the edge of the fountain. He thought that he had a lot of things to do, but first he needed to find his friend. He ordered the arrow to find the person he needed, and it immediately showed the way. A sign appeared in front of him. A notification appeared with a quest called Chasing a Lizard in the Slums, where the goal was to find Lazar in the adventurer's city of Agatal. The hero thought that usually this arrow, which he hated, did not fail him, and if this arrow was not destroyed, then he would use its power to the fullest. As the hero stood up, a child bumped into him and rushed past, apologizing for bumping into him. But the arrow abruptly turned toward the child, and a sign appeared. The side building was renovated, and the goal became catching a pickpocket. The hero read it out loud, and the child winced upon hearing it. A man nearby told the hero he was unlucky. The kids from the slums were begging from everyone here, and he should be more careful next time. After checking his pockets, the hero noticed the theft and shouted for his money. The child TSKED at being discovered. The hero followed him, shouting for him to stop and return his money. He chased after the thief, shouting for him to stop, but he continued to run away. With a wild expression, he told him to stop right now, and then he'd save a couple of his teeth. The child was surprised by such a face and thought the hero might be an adventurer. He quickly disappeared around the bend, and the hero continued running after the arrow. All this time, a crow was watching them from the side. A small child with a baby on his back was watching a bird. A man behind him said that it was quite noisy today, and they should hurry back home. The children thanked him and waved goodbye to Lazar. Lazar waved back and looked at him, repeating his thanks. That's where it all began. Toyama's first day in the open world. Continuing to follow my desires and starting my amazing adventure. The hero continues to run, shouting that he will not get away from him. The child was amazed at the persistence of the man who was chasing him. Naruhito extended his hand, almost touching the thief, shouting that he wouldn't leave him alone. Then the kid used his acro speed skill, surprising the hero. The arrow quickly showed where he disappeared to. Sitting on the roof, the boy apologized disrespectfully and said he needed to eat something too. Watching him from below, the hero yelled that he was making fun of him. Sitting on the city fortress, they were watched. Swinging her legs high in the air, the girl recalled how, in the past, holding a coin in her hands, the girl in front of her said that it was a lovely, charming platinum coin, so small, but how much happiness it could bring. And then she sighed, saying that she was still tired, and squeezed out like a lemon. She screamed, clutching her hair, that the collector's dragon had been killed and the wedding hadn't taken place. Why did they have to choose this black-haired, fox-eyed monster as their husband? She'd tried so hard to defend him, and yet he'd done this. How could this even happen? She hugged the money, saying that even though the Dragon Council had paid her generously, who was she to judge a woman for her choices? Let her play with him for a while, and then be done with it, the girl called the bishop. The Catwoman said he was putting so much effort into his mission, and maybe she should take a break. The bishop praised the robe and herself, saying she was certainly a good girl for inventing a robe with ear slits. The Catwoman asked if she was even listening. She said that the Knights of the Church, whose greatest honor is slaying a dragon, are the Angel Church, which reveres only angels and no one else. The Church is certainly powerful, but its power is not absolute. It could lose everything at any moment. That is why the bishop will do whatever is required, and will fulfill any whim of the paradise and any of her wonderful money. But she was still irritated by the phrase, "follow your desires." Why did she let him do whatever he wanted? The girl, off to the side, was thinking about how the bishop was being especially noisy today. The bishop told SVI to listen and ordered her to keep an eye on the dragon slayer and, if he got into trouble, to save him, to consider it her gratitude for the money she'd received. So I found herself at the fortress, thinking what a complicated person the bishop was. Watching the hero's chase, SVI decided that he could handle the pickpocket himself, and her task was to watch and protect him. At this time, the pickpocket found himself among a group of men who grabbed him and said that if he wanted to pass, he had to pay money. They knew that he had it. The boy screamed for them to let him go and got hit for it. The men continued to beat him, and eventually he was pinned to the ground. They sneered, saying they'd have to charge extra for disobeying. Opening the bag, the man stole it from the hero. They said he was carrying money and something interesting, and they would take it all. The guy kept saying it was his, and the man said he should break his bones as a precaution, but his face was painfully drawn to the girl. The man attacked him, while others waited their turn to the side. Because he resisted, the man wanted to hit him again to shut him up, but he stopped, feeling something. He was kicked in the back and sent flying into the far corner. The other men turned silently to look at the hero walking toward them. The men didn't understand what was happening. The hero, noticing his money, began to smile and say it was his. He grabbed the man with his bag and threw it into the air, shouting that it was his money. After neutralizing two, he went to the third, who was shouting that the Raven himself was standing behind them. He told the hero to think twice before attacking, but he didn't hear him and quickly neutralized him. He spread his palms over the man on the ground and asked, without interest, what kind of raven was that? He grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and threw him into a pile, telling him to get lost. Smiling, he said mission accomplished. Looking at the group, he wondered if he'd overdone it. He asked if they were breathing and, hearing an indistinct grunt, said they'd be fine. He took his wallet from them, which was already dirty, and turned around, hearing the boy's voice, who said to do it already. If he intended to punish him for theft, just let him do it quickly. The boy dreamed of having the same strength as Naruhito and what he would do with it. The hero thought he felt a bit ill now, and that he wasn't exactly making fun of the weak. He crouched down next to him, calling out to him and asking how old he was. The child replied that he was 11, and, with a grin, asked if he was going to break as many bones as he was, saying he was quite the adventurer. The hero hesitated and asked what was wrong with him and didn't intend to do that. The hero asked if he was a boy or a girl, and if he'd be older and have a ton of admirers. The child shouted that he was a boy, and apologized for not having such menacing eyes, which the hero took as a compliment. He then sternly asked why the kid had stolen his wallet, knowing he'd punish him, and why would he do such a thing? The boy screamed that he didn't care. It was better to be punished than to die of hunger. A man would never understand how painful and scary it was. He cried, saying that for their sake he would do anything so that they would have food. He would steal even if all his bones were broken. He would endure it. The hero felt awkward and replied that he understood, but he didn't know what to do with him now. Other children were already running toward them, calling out to Luca. The girl shielded him with her body, screaming at him to try touching him again, and she would attack. A guy nearby yelled at Nico to stop. She didn't understand why Reed said that, and he told her to look around. The man in front of her was not a slum dweller. Reed assumed that Luca had most likely robbed him, and the man had started stalking him. Meanwhile, Luca had gotten into trouble, and someone had tried to steal his money. Then the hero had come, beaten everyone up, gotten his money back, and thus saved Luca. The hero was amazed at this astonishing deduction, because that's exactly how it had all happened. Reed bowed to him. The guy said that, judging by the hero's clothes, he was an adventurer or a visitor, and said that Luca was his younger brother, and, as the older one, he was to blame for his terrible behavior. Nico began to bow for saving Luke, and apologized for yelling. The hero replied that there was nothing to bow for. Reed said he didn't know what Luca had said to him, but stealing couldn't be justified under any circumstances. After all, they were his juniors, and as the eldest, he would take the punishment, so he asked the hero to beat him up instead. Luca yelled at his brother to shut up. He was the one who did it, and he was the one who would answer for it. They started arguing. Reed shouted that they were still small and stupid, so he asked the hero to punish him alone. The hero tried to say he hadn't intended to do that, but Luca shouted that it had nothing to do with them. Nico started crying because the boys were arguing, and Reed was now yelling at her to stop while Luca again asked to be punished. The hero, standing to the side, was puzzled, saying he hadn't even said a word. Sighing, he took out some money, deciding that he would earn more later, and asked the children if they wanted to eat. He grabbed Reed's hand and told him to listen to him so they could take him to the nearest tavern. SVI, watching from above, seemed thoughtful. When they were sitting at the table with food, the hero told the children to start eating before everything got cold. Reed, watching the food, reminded them that their youngest had stolen money from the hero, and the hero replied that he knew but had considered breaking 2 or 3 of his bones as a precaution, but had changed his mind. Luca quietly called him creepy and got a beating from his elders for it. He finally apologized, and the hero said that since he'd gotten his money back, he didn't care anymore. More important was what to say to the person who was treating him to food with his pocket money. He showed the shashlik to the child, expecting gratitude. All the children quickly thanked him, and Luca accepted the food. Looking at the skewer of meat, he remarked that it had been a while since they'd paid to eat at a tavern. The hero looked at the other patrons and assumed the children were afraid their food and money would be taken away. The children faked it. Nico said that they were still children, much weaker than any adult. The hero asked how long the children had been living there and told the people at the next table not to stare. Luca replied that they'd been there since birth, and Reed asked if the hero was looking for something there. Naruhito asked him why he decided that, and the guy said that at first he noticed that his clothes were of very good quality and different from the usual clothes that all the locals wear here and were probably expensive, but he was not sure. Further, based on decent clothes, he could have turned to adventurers for help in catching the thief, but in the end he went to the slums himself and even after catching Luca, it was not profitable for him to spend his money on them buying food. He could have gone to the city, which means he has business in the slums, and after feeding them, he probably expects that they will share something with him in return. Reed said they were homeless, so asking them for money or things was pointless. But finding someone, considering they lived there and knew everyone, was the most logical thing he could ask them for in exchange for food. The hero laughed contentedly, said the guy was smart, and asked his name. Reed introduced himself by saying he was the eldest child and looked after all the children in the slums, but there weren't many of them. The hero realized that, thanks to Reed, all the orphans in this place could survive. Luca asked if that was too rude, to which the hero sternly replied that it wasn't his place to teach him manners. Luca was startled by the hero's tone, and the children looked questioningly at the trembling child. The hero was surprised, because he hadn't said anything out of the ordinary, and the other was already becoming flustered. He had remarkable intuition. Like the old man, the hero agreed with Reed, saying he was right and he was looking for someone. He pulled out a bag of coins and handed it to them, saying it was an advance payment and that they would receive more when they completed his task. Nico said it was a great success, since it was the first time in a long time they'd been given work. Reed reminded them again that their brother had stolen money from him, so was he sure? The hero replied that Reed was in charge, after all, and he didn't think he'd be brave enough to steal money from him. He turned to Luca again, saying that if he pulled something like that again, not only he, but everyone close to him would pay for it. Reed said the hero clearly wasn't the kind of person to throw money around so easily, so why did he get involved with people like Coney? The hero replied that when making deals, it's important to understand who you're working with, and that's the right thing to do. He said that they, the boys, see him as a duck that can lay golden eggs for them, but he sees them as ragamuffins ready to do anything to earn money. The hero needs to find a person, and they need easy money, and he is ready to pay them. He asked how much they'd charge for it. Reed yelled at him to wait, letting them set a price for him. That was odd. The hero quickly replied that that was incorrect. He explained to them an important rule. In trade, it is the seller who sets his prices. They should evaluate their work themselves and not have others put their price tags on it. After some thought, Reed offered a price of 5 coppers and no guarantee of finding what the hero was looking for. This satisfied Naruhito, who considered the contract concluded. Reed said it was his first time setting a price for a job, and Nico was delighted that they'd get a whole 5 coppers. The hero apologized for interrupting them, but suggested they get back to the point of the order. Naruhito explained that they needed to find a person similar to a lizard. The children asked if he was talking about lizard people, and the hero replied that it didn't matter which way he said it, as long as they understood him. He asked if they'd seen anyone like him. Reed thought for a moment, and then said that about a month ago there had been talk about lizard people settling in their slums, but he hadn't personally encountered them. But the boy noticed that he was quite famous, so much so that a raven was looking for him. The hero asked who the raven was, and the child replied that it was the name of a criminal guild. They mainly accept orders for robberies, murders, and kidnappings. The hero wondered what Lazar had gotten himself into if a criminal guild was looking for him. Reed said that adventurers and warriors of the angelic church were also looking for him, and rumor had it he'd helped the boy slay the dragon. The hero realized they were probably looking for the lizard because of him. The child at the table turned out to be a familiar face and said he hadn't expected to meet the boys in such a place. The children greeted Paolo and Shiro. Nico asked Paolo why he'd refused to eat at this place. The child said his sister smelled of food, and she offered to share. Reed actually decided to give up his share. Paolo bowed to the hero, thanking him for the meat, and said he'd managed to eavesdrop briefly on their conversation and inquired whether he might be looking for Mr. Lazar. The hero's vision began to sparkle again. The additional goal of befriending the slum orphans has been achieved. The side quest has been updated. The orphan route has been chosen. The orphans' fate is about to change. The fate of the Trena Lloyd Amstranog was predetermined. The route to the forbidden profession was not automatically available. Paolo offered to show the hero where Lazar lived. He sat down asking the child if he knew exactly where the lizard lived and told him to show him the way. Sometime later, they arrived. Nico asked the child if he had been to this place before, and he replied that he had. Reed noted that the house next to the sewer could easily hide from pursuit if anything happened. Luca suggested they go and check if Lazar was inside, but the hero replied that it wasn't necessary and that he thought the lizard was inside. The hero, without turning around, said they had completed their task and were parting ways. The children were surprised, and only Reed agreed. Taking the money, he said that if he needed help, he could find him and they would help. They lived in the square. The children said goodbye to him, and Naruhito decided there was no point in dealing with them anymore. But now, he had other things to do. The mission has been updated. Objective: find traces of Lazar. The hero, entering the house, began to examine everything and noticed that the coals were still warm, which meant that the fire had recently gone out. The hero noticed blades in the air and was surprised that he could feel them. He shouted for the blade to appear. The air around thickened into a whirlwind. Lazar, appearing in surprise, asked how he had dispelled his shadow. They found themselves opposite each other, and the hero asked Lazar if it was him, and he seemed to recognize him too. The hero smiled, saying he hadn't seen him since the battle with Draco. Lazar was very surprised, saying that couldn't be true. The hero asked the lizard if he was okay, but Lazar grabbed him, shouting if he really was Naruhito Toyama and that he had survived. The hero shouted that he wouldn't live long if the lizard kept shaking him like that he was such an old man, that he had this habit of shaking him to the point of dizziness. Lazar said he had a lot to tell him, but suggested they talk in a different setting. The hero said he had just the right spot for such a thing. They sat down in the tavern. Lazar asked them to stop and summarized. The hero took the dragon's life, met a strange elf with silver hair and the muscles of an old man. So many questions and so few answers. Lazar asked who Draco was, and the hero said Alice was embarrassed when strangers called her by her name, so he came up with a nickname. Lazar said that as soon as he escaped, the hero took the dragon's life and even made her his friend. He apologized. But Naruhito clearly had lost all common sense. Although his story sounds like a tall tale, he believes it. Lazar was glad to meet him again. Maybe he shouldn't have hidden so hard. The hero said that even Draco had praised Lazar for his ability to hide, and he admitted that he himself had been in hiding for a whole month. And then he realized how much time had passed. It had seemed like only a couple of days. Lazar said that he heard that inside the Tower of Hellel, time is distorted due to the fact that travelers find objects and relics of past wars. The Tower of Hellel is a special place for this country. The hero realized that with so much treasure, it's not for nothing that this city is called the City of Adventurers. Lazar said that common sense was still a bit lacking in this situation, wasn't it? The hero reminded him that he was from another world, so what common sense could he possibly have? Lazar replied that, frankly, he didn't care. The lizard said the hero was a good guy and the one who extended a helping hand, and everything else didn't matter, which is why he shouldn't mess with Lazar. The hero asked why, all of a sudden. He replied that it was because neither the dirty thief nor the lizardman cared about it. Lazar said that even though it was a boring story, he wanted the hero to listen to it. He said that the country he comes from is called Shadowfang. Whether the hero knew it or not, the lizardmen were a race that arose from the mistakes of the past, and were despised by all of humanity. They had no home, and no one even wanted to hire them. However, in a country engulfed in civil war and generally unstable, he was useful. Whether it was a gift or a curse, he also had the power given to him by the angel, the villain Floria, and he was loved by her. Lazar used his powers to take on various terrible jobs, only confirming the stereotypes about his race, but he does not intend to justify himself. After all, he chose his own path. Lazar considered himself simply a dirty thief who made his living by causing others suffering. The hero suddenly began to laugh. Naruhito apologized for laughing and explained that he simply thought that he was being too honest for a villain, causing suffering to others. By that logic, he was no different from him, because the hero also earned money by ending other people's lives in order to achieve what he wanted, and monsters are not averse to eating human flesh in order to live. The hero walked over heads to get what he wanted, and doesn't regret anything. He said there was only one difference between them: regret, and it was what made them so different. Lazar was ready to lend a helping hand to anyone and share his food at the very last minute. He wasn't ready to betray anyone, even if his own life depended on it. Naruhito said that even if the whole world howled about how bad the lizard was, the hero knew who he really was. This deeply moved and perplexed Lazar. The hero admitted that he wants to build his own house by the lake. That's what he dreamed about when they were both threatened with death, and, if you think about it, they are both lucky. He thought so because there were few people with whom he had the same desires, and even more so, no one shared such secrets with him. The hero survived and now intends to fulfill his dream, continue killing people, take on jobs, save money, and build his house by the lake. He extended his hand to his friend and told Lazar that he was on his side, and he was on his, and as he had promised, they would continue their dialogue. Naruhito suggested talking about their dreams, which they would definitely achieve together. Lazar asked if someone like him was free to dream about anything, and the hero replied that he was free. The lizard spoke of the people he had caused only suffering who would never forgive him, but the hero replied that he would forgive him for that. Lazar replied that he would only bring him misfortune. Naruhito chuckled and said that he was causing 3 times more trouble than he was, and then Lazar said that he was being chased by a raven. The hero replied that it was an ordinary blackbird, so was there really anything scary about them? He struck the bird and said that it wasn't about them now, but about their dreams. Lazar shouted, "Is it fashionable to strike like that?" Then the hero asked about the raven. He asked if these crows were scarier than Draco. This made Lazar come to his senses and laugh. He said that after the battle with the dragon itself, the raven became like a child's nightmare for the hero. The hero asked why he was laughing so much, and the lizard replied that he was simply amused by Naruhito's way of thinking. Lazar was moved to tears, but he was still glad that fate itself had brought them together. The lizard said that he wanted to open his own shop by the lake. Their desires are indeed similar, and he also wants to achieve this. The hero agreed with him and said that as long as they were alive with him, they would strive for their dream. He said they would devote all their strength to this until they achieved it. They could not die. Lazar replied that despite his sins and the sins of his ancestors, he would fulfill this wish. The hero said that was well said and that they should drink for it. They had the money. The lizard put down the bottle and said that the angel church makes a mead called Angel's Kiss. An angel's kiss would mark the fulfillment of their dream, and asked the hero how he liked the idea. The men began discussing each other's ideas and having a good time. But Nico approached them, looking ill at ease, calling the hero. He was at a loss when he saw the beaten girl. She begged him, calling him Big Brother, to save Reed and Luke. Lazar picked her up, telling her to be careful. Lazar asked the hero if he knew her and noticed her terrible wounds. He needed to take her to a less crowded place and treat her wounds. The hero explained that she and a couple of other boys had helped him find him. The Wise Choice side quest was updated. The goal was to decide the fate of the children. She whispered that it was the raven's fault. At that moment, Luke's hand was stepped on while he was lying on the ground. The man in the cloak asked about the runaway girl. Pressing harder on his wrist, he added that overall, it didn't matter, and now it was time to tell them where this lizard and the man in the black robe were. The hero asked Nico where the rest of the guys were, and she replied that Pello and Shiro managed to escape. But Reed and Luca covered them and got caught themselves. Lazar remembered those boys and said they could be killed. He asked the hero what the horses would do. The hero didn't understand why they were asking him this, and the lizard explained that Naruhito had saved his life and was free to do with it as he pleased. The hero asked if these crows were really that dangerous. They explained that they were connected to nobles and guilds throughout the empire. Simply put, they were the local crime bosses. The hero began to think about it. Naruhito said they wouldn't go rescue them, and Lazar called out to him in confusion. The hero asked if he understood the risk they were taking. He turned to Nico, saying that they had helped him, and he would pay them back, each of them his own. The girl understood and thanked her older brother. She apologized for interrupting and thanked the lizard for her first aid. The hero asked why she had turned to him, and it seemed obvious to the girl. She said that it was natural that a child who met a kind adult would want to ask him for help, forgetting that he had been responsible for himself all his life. But she was glad they'd met someone like him and thanked him for treating them like people. She said goodbye with a smile. As she left, the lizard asked the hero if he was sure of his decision. He was angry and wondered why they were thanking him. Screens with a side quest appeared. The system advised that if the hero wanted to leave the slums safely, he should refuse to help the children, and the raven would turn its attention to them and let him go. If he wanted to continue living a peaceful life in the city, he should avoid contact with the ravens, as they spare no one. He tried to convince himself there was no point in helping them. They met once, helped each other, and then went their separate ways. The system highlighted the next goal, leaving the slums after chasing the lizard. He thought the wise decision would be to leave. The system revealed that this decision would result in the children's death. Suddenly he howled loudly and shouted that he didn't care. While the system was issuing warnings, he asked the lizard if there was any point in saving them, trying to find a reason to help. Lazar asked what he thought about it. The hero replied that he believed they would need kitchen workers when they opened the bakery, and the lizard agreed. Naruhito called out loudly to Nico. He asked her if she could cook, and the girl, trembling, replied that she could only roast a rat. The hero quickly replied that she was hired. He congratulated her because she was now officially working for Lazar's bakery, but at the moment they were critically short of staff, and to make up for the shortage of workers, he wanted her to introduce them to her friends, and now they needed to go and conduct an interview for them, and after passing it, they would become their employees. The hero, as an employer, wouldn't allow anyone to harm his workers. She was trembling and confused, and he tried to think of something, but finding no answer, he turned to Lazar, asking him to say something. And then Naruhito shouted that they would save her friends, causing the girl to smile. She hugged him and thanked him. The system indicated that the side quest, chasing a lizard through the slums, had changed its course, and now he wouldn't be able to leave safely. A new chain of side quests had been opened. The hero shouted that it was actually Lazar's idea, but he quickly replied that he didn't understand what he was talking about. The hero said that since he wanted to help them so much, he was now obliged to give his all to save them, and asked if he now realized what a despot he was, lording it over the lizard. Lazar said he was ready to go with him anywhere, and do anything he asked. They bumped fists and moved on, as they had some unfinished business. The new goal was to save the children and deal with the crows. If this was accomplished, the route with the crows would disappear and they would not appear again in the main story. But it was necessary to hurry. Luke watched his brother suffer. The man in the cloak says that the sounds that cute girls make when crunching bones are much more melodic than men's, and it was a shame that they missed the girl with cat ears. She had such a gentle voice. He turned to Reed and suggested that he simply tell him what he wanted to hear. Unlike his children, he didn't have much free time. He knows that the children know everything that happens in the slums, and he is looking for the lizard people, and the guy in the black robe, he needs to tell them where they are. Reed chuckled and replied that he had no idea. He was hit again, and the stranger said that maybe that girl had already run to the guy in the black robe asking for help. But he considered it futile, since no one would stand up for such scum as horses. The only ones who could stand up to the crows were the knights of the church. He asked Reed if he knew what mussels were. Or maybe he knows what foie gras is or what Ronaldo stands in the museum, but the scum don't even know that. He said that it was because they were not people, he was lucky to be born into a good family among people. But the only entertainment for him was killing a maid or hugging a commoner until her bones crunched. He told an interesting fact that girls crying in agony in the face of death always scream, "Daddy," and they themselves came running to his doorstep because Daddy beat and bullied them. Reed shouted that he was a sick bastard, and he sighed, saying that it's no fun with men, they don't even cry, so that's the end. He stabbed Reed and suggested that they end it. He smiled, telling the boy that if he didn't do anything, he'd go to the next world. He might be a common scumbag, but he still wanted to live. They let go of Luca, who ran up to the wounded man. The man offered to make a deal. He suggested that they tell him where the guy in the robe and the lizard were, and he saves Reed's life. Reed whispered to his brother not to speak, and the man raised his leg over the dagger to kill, but Luca shouted that he would tell everything. He said they must be in an abandoned mansion in the old neighborhood next to the sewer canal. Reed told the younger man he was a fool. The man said the answer was so-so, and they were down 5 points, hitting Reed. Luca shouted that he swears by him, that he took the man in the robe there, and they separated, and he doesn't know where they are now. The man thought for a moment, and remembered they weren't looking there. They started to decide what to do with the children, and the man said they were going to die anyway, so he didn't see the point in wasting time on them. Luke shouted at them because they had an agreement and they promised that they would cure Reed. The man laughed, saying that looking at that naive face, of course he wouldn't have saved her. He told him to trust people less, they would tell him anything just to get what they wanted, but it was time for them to get to work, and they wished them death. The man sensed something interesting was about to happen and decided to bet 1 silver coin that Luca would get angry and attack him. Others bet money that he would cry and do nothing, or that he would fly into a rage. Luca shouted, asking what was so funny about it, since Reed was dying. But that only made the bandits laugh even more. They started teasing, further demonstrating how much they didn't care. The man in the cloak called it one of the joys of his job, watching their kind die right before his eyes. But he was getting pretty fed up. Luca didn't understand why they were laughing and why they were having so much fun. Reed asked his brother to stop squeezing his wound. Crying, Luca asked the angel why all this, why them, why always only them. They just want to live. The man said it was time to wrap up the show before it became completely unnecessary and told him to stop, because the angels wouldn't hear his prayers. The man asked what else to expect from a piece of trash who, even on the brink of a loved one's death, couldn't become enraged. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed. People were enveloped in fog. At this time, the children were swallowed by a shadow. A man in a raincoat discovered the loss. A hero appeared from the fog and said that the stage was ready. He ordered the blade to cut everyone. There was movement. The man's arm was cut off before he realized what was happening. He could only see a shadow through the fog. The hero grinned and asked if he was still alive, how strong he was. White thought was replaced by blackness. The hero said that although everything worked out thanks to Lazar, he thinks he's become addicted to using blades, and he still needs to leave one alive. He wants to know how many people are involved in this. He leaned over to the man, saying that this one looked better than the others and was dressed more respectably. He began to examine his things. He found the letter and opened it to read, but everything inside was encrypted, and he did not understand anything. He thought maybe Lazar would figure out what was encrypted. At that moment, someone approached him from behind and ordered him to raise his hands, pointing his gun. The hero was surprised to see the cloaked guy who had just been lying on the ground. He asked what was wrong with his face. Did he really think he'd killed him? The hero was surprised to see a familiar face. The man mockingly asked if the hero really thought he'd killed him. The hero decided he'd planted a double of himself on him. The man told the hero to give him the letter back, and he threw it at his feet, for which the man called him a good boy. He asked if the hero had managed to read it, and he replied that he couldn't read. This didn't surprise the man, because he had heard that he had previously been a servant, so it wasn't surprising. He began to decide how to deal with the hero. At that moment, he thought he was absolutely certain he had killed a man with a face just like his, so why was he alive? The stranger pointed a crossbow at him and said that Naruhito had cut down many people. And then he had the good sense to ask how he had escaped death and let him think about whether he would answer one of his questions. He ordered him to tell him where the lizard was, since the boss had asked to bring him back alive. Naruhito was absorbing the information and wanted to know more about them. The man called him strange. The hero is strong and healthy, though he's a bit of a nutcase. But he seems to have everything he needs, so why bother standing up for some rabble and creating unnecessary problems for himself? The man didn't understand this. He asked the hero if he understood the risk he was taking by crossing the crow's path, and the hero said to enlighten him. The stranger was amazed by his fearlessness, and asked if he really had such a hobby as playing the hero, and that life was not at all precious because of him he had lost the entertainment of listening to charming screams, and he would be obliged to compensate for it. The hero chuckled and said that this was his kind of adventure. Naruhito said that it was very bad to leave the children who helped him in an adventure. The man asked what kind of nonsense he was talking about, since they were just worthless trash, and the hero asked what he even understood about value. A commander who abandoned his subordinates and turned them into cannon fodder. Unlike him, the hero cannot afford to lose his workers. He envies such short-sighted fools. The stranger said that anyone who dared to be so insolent died very quickly. The hero saw that he was only holding a small crossbow and began to provoke the enemy, shouting at him to try it, and using his combat thinking skill. This crossbow was effective at both long and close range within the blade's reach, but its immortality ability worried the hero more. The stranger said that if the hero died, he would have no problems. When he was about to shoot, the hero moved towards him. He threw a dagger at him, and the weapon fell out of the enemy's hands. Next, he finished him off with his fists to the chin. When the enemy began to fall, he pulled out his blade, saying that he was taking it. The man didn't understand what he was doing, and the hero said that he had come up with a cool thing and decided to try it on him, and the result met his expectations. He hit him again, ordered him to lie down, and took an object out of his pocket. He asked him who ordered them for him and cut off his finger, saying that for wrong answers and silence, he would cut off each of his fingers. But he promised to give it a try if he answered all his questions, and he asked again who had ordered them. The man shouted that he had no idea, as no one knew the boss's name, and lost another finger. Then the hero asked how many were looking for them and where they were right now, to which he was told that he was the only one who took on this order. He shouted that the entire organization was hunting this lizard, but he was the only one on the trail and didn't tell anyone where he was or who he was with. The hero said he'd finished him off earlier and asked why he was still alive. The man called him names and told him to think twice, saying he was the third son of the Bora family. Was he really so eager to make one of the most influential families in the empire his enemy? He quickly lost a finger, and the hero again said he'd already killed him twice and asked why he was still alive. He quickly explained that his skill was a second chance, so before he died, he could create a clone of himself and transfer his consciousness into it. He explained that he'd already used him, and if the hero killed him, he'd die. He started asking if he needed money and power, and that he could recommend him to their boss, who would get him whatever he wanted. But the hero asked if he knew the names of those children. He asked again if he knew the names of those he had tortured, and he shouted, "Why should he know the names of small bugs, children from the slums? They are not even considered people, like uncut dogs, so why should he remember them all?" The hero decided to drop the matter and asked that since he was hunting a lizard, he should tell him what he knew. He shouted that he was a clueless, ordinary member of a cursed race, and these dirty, stinking outcasts too. He asked why the hero had bothered these bugs. The main character said that in the end, it was his own adventure, and he continued it no matter what. Smiling, the young man asked how he could continue his own, then corrected him that he was wrong, and their adventure with friends, and not help them. A frightened Wiseman turned pale, and did not understand what he meant, and asked him what he was saying. The protagonist grabbed the boy while he was asking about his adventure, clarifying that he had only stood up for that stupid reason. The young man named his friend Lazar. The hero continued to say that this name belongs to the lizardmen, that the guy was hunting, and Lazar bakes incredible bread, and the taller and older one that he didn't kill was called Reed, and the little one with the pretty face is Ruka. The girl with the cat ears is called Nico. Pello has curly hair. The smallest one on the back is called Shiro. The enemy did not understand why the guy was telling him all this, to which he heard the answer that he partly understood it. The hero, lowering his head, repeated that he understood him perfectly well, because whether they died or lived, he still had no need to know their names. Wiseman nervously agreed with him because it was nonsense and they were very similar to the hero. But he was not like that, and he was accepted into the Crows, and he gave his name, trying to add something else. The protagonist again agreed with him that they were indeed similar. The crow boy didn't understand and asked what he meant. Naruhito took the knife and pointed it at the guy, saying that this is why he doesn't care what his name is. Wiseman burst into tears, ordering him to be released immediately, lest the raven find him and kill him and he would never be able to live his life as usual. The protagonist interrupted him and asked for understanding. Naruhito said that now that he knew their names, he couldn't just let him go with this knowledge, putting a knife to the throat of the guy lying on his chest. Wiseman continued to deny it, even though he'd promised to let him go. The protagonist laughed in response. The protagonist asked how he was supposed to keep his promises to such disgusting people as him. The guy replied that he was a real monster, to which Naruhito only mockingly said goodbye to him. The main character finished with the guy, sending him to the next world while cursing him. Naruhito looked up and sighed tiredly. The guy took his knife and wiped it on the dead man's clothes. The search was complete. The system indicated that the dirty job, side quest, had been successfully completed. The young man had successfully eliminated all witnesses and retrieved information about the Crow faction, and was recommended to join the faction that could protect him. The main character was walking back to the shelter. On the way to Naruhito, he met a lizard man and asked him if he was okay. The main character asked the beastman where the boys were, and he silently led him into the room. The guy walked there and saw a girl sitting near the wounded boys. The girl with cat ears raised her head and called out to the hero, calling him Big Brother. Naruhito called out to the boy named Reed. The beastman said he was able to stop the bleeding, but that was all. Reed apologized to his older brother, as he had only caused him problems. Naruhito asked him not to worry about it, since it was all over. Reed smiled and said that crows were dangerous after all. The boy acknowledged his guilt and said that because of them, his older brother was now in danger. Naruhito asked him not to waste his energy on this, as he would soon recover. The boy knew he couldn't pull through and asked if he'd ever become anything like his older brother. The girl called out Reed's name, to which he merely responded that it was all unfair. The main character was angry because he was again unable to save, telling the boy that he was here and holding his palm. The hero decided that he would accompany the boy on his final journey and told him not to be afraid of anything. Naruhito said that the place where he ends up will not harm him. In that place he will meet those he loved and spend with them a peaceful and joyful eternity. Even though the boy leaves first, he will still meet his friends again. The boy asked his brother if he would meet him there. Naruhito paused and replied that he would try to be there too, but he understood that the bright place did not favor murderers like him. Reed, crying, replied that he understood him and was saddened. Reed said he wanted to leave this damn city and become like Naruhito. The protagonist replied that he could. Reed smiled and called out to his older brother and closed his eyes for the last time. The protagonist told him to sleep peacefully. Everyone around him prayed. The system said a child from the Reed slums and the condition was met. Talk about the afterlife with someone who has a higher intelligence. Kill the dragon and refuse marriage with the dragon, who fulfilled all the conditions. The main character didn't understand what kind of update it was, and suddenly a girl appeared on a chair next to him and called him a dragon slayer. The boy stood up and asked her who she was. And a special event occurred, the appearance of the main saint, Svi Dakmashara. The girl asked if he was going to save the boy. The main character didn't understand how long she had been there, because he didn't even notice how she appeared. The guys saw the girl's aura and perked up. The protagonist staggered, thinking she was behind the monster. The girl asked why he was staring at him like he'd seen the monster, but the guy just glanced sideways. The main character remembered that she was at the embassy, and the girl just smiled. They say that she was glad that the guy remembered her. The girl smiled sweetly and greeted the dragon slayer once again, introducing herself as the chief saint of the Church of Angels named Svi. The beastman was surprised and asked if she was a holy virgin and a secret weapon in the Church of Angels. Svi replied that it was rude to call a girl a weapon, but he was right, and there were more important things to discuss. The girl said that the boy was about to die, and asked if the guy wanted to leave everything as it was. The protagonist was angry and replied that he didn't know what Tat was trying to achieve, but suddenly remembered the wounded man. Naruhito asked the maiden if she was the one who healed Draco's burns. The girl agreed and said that her mistress had ordered her to do so, otherwise she would have left her to die. The protagonist asked if she could help Reed. Svi replied that it was no problem and gave her 2 thumbs up. The young man understood that she had arrived suspiciously on time, and he did not believe that she had good intentions, so he asked what she wanted in return. The girl said the mistress had told her to keep an eye on the dragon slayer and help him if he needed help. The girl with cat ears called out to her brother, who told Nika to immediately approach Lazar and hide behind him. The girl didn't understand why he was being so cautious, or why he deserved this. The protagonist replied, "Since mice run away in fear from a snake, everything should be obvious." Sviata replied that such an interesting allegory poorly described the danger posed by the mistress and asked him to think faster. The protagonist turned to Reed, who was coughing. The girl added that the boy had very little time left. The saint asked what the dragon slayer would do, and whether he would allow her to save the boy. The main character was angry and looked at the boy. Reed was getting worse. The beastman called out to Naruhito, and the boy, through the pain, said that he wanted to live. The boy heard barking. The protagonist understood that if there was a chance to save someone's life, then he had to take advantage of it, remembering his dog. The main character made a choice and approached the saint and asked what the decision was. Naruhito bowed to the saint and asked her to save the boy. The protagonist said that he knew what the saint was capable of, and he was ready to pay any price. The young man asked to be pulled out of the clutches of death while others watched from the sidelines. The main character did not raise his head and continued to ask the maiden. Svi asked the dragon slayer to lift her up. The protagonist raised his head and said that his eyes were as beautiful as his mistress's, and his words were so pure that she could not ignore them. The virgin added that the lady asked him to repay the debt, and she certainly could not refuse him. The main character looked at her with anger, saying that she absolutely had to save his life, otherwise she couldn't even dream of mercy. Naruhito stood up and continued to look at her in horror. Svi replied that she expected nothing less from the dragon collector slayer. The maiden spoke about the condition and remembered that her mistress loved money. The girl raised her finger and said that the winter season is approaching with a month of strong winds and snowfalls. The main character had to prepare 50 platinum coins. The beast lizard was indignant and said that it was unrealistic to prepare for winter with so much money. I asked the Dragon Slayer if he would listen to his friend. The protagonist told her to listen to him and not others, and agreed to the condition, asking only to save the boy. Svi replied that she heard him and began to cast a spell. She called upon the burial inventory of the church oath, which served as a contract, and, if violated, a person risked becoming incapacitated. The beastman asked if such an item had disappeared during the war, to which the girl replied that he knew a lot, but the burial inventory and his blessing had not disappeared. They were simply safely hidden. The friend continued to dissuade Naruhito. The man asked the beast if he understood the risks, and added that if he did not fulfill the oath, his whole life would never be the same. But the protagonist didn't listen and asked if a bloody fingerprint would do as a signature, to which the girl agreed and offered a knife. The friend called out to Naruhito again. The protagonist turned around and apologized, replying that he was right and that he might regret it, but now it was important to save Reed. The man of faith agreed, but turned to the saint. Lazar replied that he had heard that a church oath could be signed by two people, and the protagonist was very surprised. Lazar replied that if one of their beastmen decides to buy a one-way ticket, they will go with him to the end and cut his finger. The beastman made his mark and asked the holy lady if she minded, handing the scroll back. The main character told his friend that he was a fool who answered something stupidly, and that he was hearing it from someone just as stupid. The saint was surprised by such a rarity that the beastmen were willing to go to the bottom for the sake of strangers. Svi began to tell the Dragon Slayer and the Shadowfang Kingdom native that they had signed the church oath. Having bowed, the girl said that she was the main holy virgin of Svidakmashara, declares that this oath has become the absolute name of the angels. The protagonist told her not to chatter, but to quickly cure the boy, to which she stated that she was already starting. The girl raised her hands and, using magic, made a hand placement, and the boy lit up. Rit opened his eyes and looked at his hand, surprised by the pain that had disappeared. The girl threw herself on Reed's neck, and everyone started approaching him, asking if anything was bothering him, to which he refused. Virgo began to say that the boy was lucky to have returned to the world of the living, and that he should thank the Dragon Slayer. Reed looked questioningly at his older brother, continuing to hug his sister. The boy asked what his older brother had done, to which the protagonist covered the boy's eyes and replied that everything would be fine now. The saint called out to the Dragon Slayer. The girl replied that he had shown her something beautiful, and she had healed the hand of another child. The maiden said that this boy was very interesting and giggled, but, however, the Dragon Slayer and Shadowfang must remember the oath they gave. Svi said that once they had the money, they needed to take it to the headquarters at the Church of Angels. The girl disappeared, and the main character asked if she had left. The beastman replied that he was most likely right. The main character and the beastman collapsed on the floor, and the guy asked what kind of monster it was, to which his friend replied that she was one of the strongest angels in the church, and that he was meeting her in person for the first time. The beastman heard that she was equal in fighting power to an entire battalion of holy knights. They were lucky that she did not touch them. The protagonist had been listing the old man's fights, and now this too, and didn't understand how much was possible. The beastman said it wasn't the first time, so it didn't matter. Naruhito was just as much of a threat as they were. The system appeared and said that the side quest, chasing the lizard in the alley, and the root of the children from the slums, was 100% completed. The list of rewards was listed, and after completing this chain of quests, he would meet someone who would help them uncover the secret power of the blade. The girl sat and leaned on her hands while the other watched her. The girl continued to think and talk about herself, worry about her colleague Svi. The girl shook and denied it, because Svi was not stupid, and she knew what this was fraught with, but she communicated very little with people, but still had to cope with the task, otherwise they would incur the wrath of the Dragon Lady. Svi calling her, reporting that she had returned. The bishop became serious again, and replied that she was glad to see her finished with her business. Svi smiled and replied that she had done as she was told, and now the Dragon Slayer had killed a couple of people from the Raven. The bishop was surprised. The girl leaned her hands on the table and was surprised that he got into a fight with the crows, since he had just arrived in the city. Resigned, she said it wasn't that important, checking to see if anything else had happened. Svi showed her the contract. Svi said with a smile that she had made the church oath between the Dragongrass So and his friend on their own blood. The bishop was very surprised by this. Spy added that for her services, he promised to bring 50 platinum coins by winter and, as the lady said, she did not help him for nothing, but made a deal with them. Mistress Kip and Squeak was very angry and asked why she did that. The girl replied that the Dragon Slayer reminded her of her mistress. Spy said his eyes reminded her of her previous mistress, and so she decided to make a fair deal with him. The mistress was surprised and fainted. The girl understood that the Church of Angels was facing collapse. The girl in the cloak lifted the chair and moved it to another place. The knight continued to restore order, putting everything in its place. Standing in the middle of the room, she explained that she'd made a bigger mess than she'd intended, and that being a pig in someone else's house was bad manners, so she'd start cleaning up right away. But suddenly, people started calling her. The man started yelling at her and asking what she was doing. The knight, proud and smiling, replied that she was cleaning, and the man said that wasn't what he was asking. The man asked if she realized who she was dealing with, as they were one of the 20 most noble families in the empire. The girl tried to remember and began to repeat, saying they were the sad ones, but the man misinterpreted it or said he was from the Bora family. The man asked who she was, and why all 50 of his people had been killed. The girl was surprised and asked if there really were that many of them, since she hadn't counted them herself, but she had warned them, even though stupid people are so rude and scary. The man saw the coat of arms on the girl and was surprised. A man from the Barrel family asked if she was a knight of the church, to which she agreed and said that, in truth, she had come on the matter of his third son. The girl narrowed her eyes and said that his third son seemed to be a member of the church's enemies, asking if this was true. The man became angry. The rude man said that no matter what they did to his son, he would not say a word. Alice was very surprised by such touching devotion of the family, and she did not expect that he was capable of such feelings, but she grabbed the sword, and the man asked her to stop. The man asked if the crow was her goal, but she replied that her goal was to destroy the enemies of the church. The man asked why, then kill his people. The rude man added that it wasn't to her advantage. The girl asked how he hadn't realized this yet, since she had come to destroy them all. The man became frightened. The girl smiled menacingly and again replied that it was as obvious as day. Raising his sword, the knight said that the Church of Angels is justice, and anyone who strays from the righteous path is subject to death. And the ravens are evil, those who support them and their wicked families, all of them are subject to cleansing. The man stopped her and asked if the church was serious about going against the nobility, since he was a nobleman, a distant relative of His Imperial Majesty, and had a right to the throne. The girl was surprised. The man added that his eldest son only got married during the engagement process, and his youngest was only 9 years old. The girl replied that it was pity, and the man asked if she knew what was happening to the orphans in this city. He thought that even though she was a knight, she was still a little girl. The girl asked him not to worry about it. The girl presented the sword to the man's face, and he was frightened. The knight said that she destroyed her eldest son, who loved to take apart women of easy virtue, did the same with her middle son, who loved to abuse the bodies of children, and destroyed her youngest, who enjoyed taking apart and putting together the corpses of animals like a mosaic. The girl smiled, showed 2 fingers up, and said that they were all already in the next world, and the man would go with them under the wing of an angel. The man was horrified and did not consciously understand what she had done, while the girl was preparing to strike. With one movement, she sent the man to the next world. The girl, smiling, wished him all the best. The knight raised her hands up and shouted that she had done a good deed and carried out justice, so today she had not lived in vain. The girl had an idea that with the help of justice she could still find out everything about the ravens, but a voice called out to her and said that she had finished, naming the knight Stru. Another female knight said that she had overdone it a bit. Stru called out to Claudia and said they'd done a great job. She asked if she'd managed to meet the people she'd been looking for. She agreed, but said she'd rather not have seen them. Claudia got angry and said that there were a lot of lost souls in the garden of this estate, and they said that the Bora family regularly killed the maids and that it almost made her throw up. Stru asked what they said, to which the girl replied that all the information from the Archbishop and Wiseman Bor, the third son of the family, was a member of the Ravens, and the souls of the recently killed girls saw his tattoo. Stru replied that there was nothing but filth everywhere, which they had to clean up, and it was disgusting. Claudia agreed. The girl asked what they would do with the rest of Bor's family. Stru replied that there was no one left, which surprised the knight. Stru said with a smile that they were trying to escape, so she destroyed them all. The girl added that she first checked everyone through the courts to be sure whether they could be considered evil. Claudia said there were children there, so the girl asked what the problem was, and she remained silent. Claudia apologized for always having to do everything for them. Stru didn't understand the problem. Stru replied that in any case, only the third son, Uiman, remained, but the girl changed her name to Uisman. Stru raised her hands and said that they were the sword of the powerless, so they must do their work diligently. Claudia agreed with this, and with a kind smile asked how this was possible without their royal majesty. Stru asked if she thought the girl was making fun of her, but the knight merely apologized and laughed. Suddenly, Claudia looked surprised. The girl turned back as the knight called her name. The girl replied that the soul was rejoicing and the passage of the sacrament had been completed, and Stru should also see it. Claudia used Pale's spear magic. Stru looked forward and was surprised. There was light ahead of the girls. The souls of the other girls screamed that Wiseman was dead and laughed, and the knights thanked them for letting them know the truth about the deceased. The souls of the girls said that he had experienced torment before death, and finally got what he deserved. Then they thanked him for what they had done. Stru was surprised by the disappearance. Claudia replied that nothing else weighed on this earth for these souls. Claudia said that these souls left this world, going on a new path, and she is happy for them, because they have suffered enough. Stru noted that there were other people hunting the raven, besides them. Claudia wanted to ask her partner something, but a voice called out, authorizing the report. A man came and said that the Order's secret police had confirmed the fact of a mass murder in the slums. The man continued to say that the bodies were collected and several black feather tattoos were found on them, and that Wiseman Bora's body was among them. Stru ordered to continue sending spies to gather information about the surrounding area, because someone dared to steal the loot of the Knights of the Church, and they had to find out who this insolent man was. The man accepted the order. Claudia asked the girl if she wanted to get involved in this, to which she replied that you had decided everything, and they are the swords of the Church of Angels, and they only have one role. The girl added that those who managed to find them before the Knights were dangerous individuals, and they could not be left unpunished. Stru said that if they found him, they would interrogate him, and if he served justice, then that was fine, after which they would part ways with him. If they can't answer their questions, then it means they will be wrong, and if they turn out to be evil, the girl said, not finishing her sentence. Stru smiled maliciously. The girl said it was time for them to continue this wonderful mission, and her partner supported her, calling her a precious ball for the church. The girl walked forward and was the first knight of Strupura. The girl was curious who the killer was, but they knew for sure that it was the man with black hair. The protagonist and the boys arrived at the children's residence. Naruhito asked her in a casual tone if they lived there. The girl with cat ears said that Paolo and Shiro hadn't returned yet. The boys sat down, and the dark-haired boy called out to Reed. The boy said that everything that happened to him was his fault, but suddenly Reed put a hat on the boy's head. The boy was very surprised, and Reed replied that she was all covered in blood and dust, but she was still dear to him, so Mr. Lazar gave her to him. Reed said that all they were doing was causing trouble to their elders, and now they should repay them in kind, to which the boy agreed, and they bumped fists. The boy asked why they were there. Reed replied that it happened while he was sleeping. The boys chatted for a while, and then the older boys moved them. Having met the elders, Reed and Nico called out to their brother and, kneeling down, thanked him. The main character didn't understand why they called him brother, and the boy explained that this was his way of showing respect, and said that he would never forget how he saved them. The girl with cat ears began to speak. The girl said that when she heard they would be helped, she could finally breathe a sigh of relief, and tears welled up in her eyes. The main character lit up and asked her not to cry. The protagonist asked his friend if he would like to say something or see how they behave, to which he replied that it was the result of his influence. Naruhito said he wants to hire them again. Reed jumped up and said that if they needed to work for him, then they were ready to do any job and would not require any money, for which he received a hit on the head. The protagonist began to explain that working without pay was bullshit, and therefore the conditions were a full-time position with various assignments and later special missions. Naruhito said that there would be a full 5-day work week, and that the salary would be paid at the end of the month, and an advance payment and bonus would be paid twice a year, which greatly confused the children. The hero asked if they were interested, to which they responded in agreement. since such work would not be found in the slums with fire. The boy apologized and said that he did not intend to stay there, which surprised the children. The main character said that for now they would work for him, but then he advised them to find a normal job and earn their living through honest labor. The children began to cry with joy, and even Reed, wiping her face, said that she could not hold back her tears. If this was a death dream, then let it never end. Because the main character did not understand what was happening and said that if they did not want to, they could refuse. The main character asked his friend what it was, and he said that Naruhito was a terrible person who ate children until they cried. A friend of one of the boys asked to be quiet and asked Reed if he was okay or not. The kids pounced on Luca, hugging him while the boys stood aside. The children ran to the protagonist and said that since Luca had woken up, it was time for them to get out of there. Reed ended the story by saying that Luca himself knew what happened next. Suddenly, the girl called out to Shero and Pello, thereby drawing the boys' attention. The girl with cat ears hugged the babies and was glad that they were safe. You asked the kids if they were injured, to which they replied that they were okay, and that they were glad that you were okay too. The curly-haired boys said they hid and fell asleep. The protagonist was surprised and said that since everyone was arguing, let them follow him. Naruhito walked forward, and behind him came the kids. And last was Lazar. The main character went into brothels and was refused everywhere, after which he entered the next door, and an elderly lady with an angry face greeted the guests. The lady looked at the children and said they were a bunch of dirty kids. The old lady asked her if they wanted to eat, adding that the cost for one person to stay would be 10 bronze coins, and they were surprised. But suddenly, the lady screamed and asked about food in a rude manner, to which they immediately agreed. Afterwards, the children were scattered. Some were playing in the yard or washing themselves, and some were eating. After some time, all the children slept together in one room. Lazar said that for them, there was no world outside the slums, and they were very exhausted. The beastmen added that they now had a chance to escape, as they now had a strange man who would protect them. This statement greatly surprised the protagonist. The guy said they'd be working hard for him. Lazar replied that that didn't mean he wouldn't protect them. The beast man said he'd given them work and a chance to see a new world, essentially performing a miracle for them. The protagonist suddenly remembered his conversation with Taro. The guy remembered his dog friend, with whom he talked about how they would go on an adventure and help everyone. Lost in his thoughts, the guy asked out loud if it would be more fun this way. The protagonist returned and said that now it was time for them to discuss what to do next. Lazar said he didn't mind, but first he offered to have a drink with him and poured alcohol into the glass. Lazar offered him a shot and asked him not to drink it all at once. The protagonist sniffed it, said it smelled fine, and drank it. Naruhito licked his lips and said it was delicious, and Lazar said it was nothing less than an angel's kiss. The beastman said that this was a blessing from heaven itself, placing the glass on the table. Lazar added that the church has kept the method for making this wine a secret for 200 years, and turning it into mead, the drink of the gods, is not so simple. The protagonist replied that they have a poetic name for fermentation. The beastman didn't understand what the boy was talking about. The protagonist explained that wine is made from aged juice and yeast, which made Lazar laugh. The first man said that rising bread and wine from grappa grapes were all miracles of angelic hands. The boy was shocked. The protagonist asked if they didn't know how to make pork bread, to which the beastman replied that only the bishops of the angelic church or the saints knew this. It was called the secret of angels. Lazar called out to Naruhito, and he told him to forget about it. The protagonist looked at the glass and said that these angels were doing a great job. The beastman replied that he'd already thought the protagonist was enlightened, to which the protagonist merely laughed. The protagonist returned to the conversation about the future, and suddenly a boy called out to him. Reed asked to join the conversation and promised to sit quietly and not interrupt anyone. Suddenly the beastman stood up and addressed the main character with a grin, calling him a black-haired slave. Lazar asked where they were going to go after the pogrom in the slums, and the boy supported him, saying that they would follow him anywhere. The protagonist declared that now they would break through to the top. Naruhito said that after being in the slums, he realized that these people have no mercy and rob the weak, which made him very fed up. The protagonist noted that this is precisely why they will strive to the top. Naruhito raised his finger and said that he would not dare take anything away from them. The guy added that this required money, while the guys listened to him attentively. The protagonist added that if he didn't raise the required amount by the deadline, they would be finished. Reed sadly remarked that his brother had gone to such lengths for people like them, but Reed replied that it wasn't a problem. The guy replied that if the boy had died there, he wouldn't have been able to eat normally, and he did it to really hurt that city. Lazar said that if a child dies in front of you, you save him, because this is natural for an adult. Naruhito asked her friend if he hadn't said the same thing, but the beastman replied that words were clearly not his strong point. The guy cleared his throat and said that in any case they should move towards the goal. The main character smiled and said that first they earn money and then they begin the fun part of getting money. The young man asked what they thought a poor wanderer without a garage or connection status should do to rise in the city of adventurers. The beastman said that it would not have been possible anywhere else. Lazar added that in the city of adventurers, Agatal, everything is much simpler. The guy said that now they needed to become adventurers. The protagonist noted that now it was clear to him what the guild looked like since the kids were working hard, they should also keep up with them, and Lazar agreed with him. The guys stood in front of the entrance to the guild. The protagonist opened the doors and apologized in advance for the intrusion. The guy stood still while a bunch of people were busy with their own affairs. Everyone in the room had their own things to do. Someone was offering a task, someone was asking people to come to them with a task, and someone was simply chatting with others. Some people didn't want to participate in the tasks, but others talked them out of it, and some just ate. The main character watched everyone from the side while people were talking to each other. Naruhito's eyes lit up, his cheeks turned red, and he himself, I don't understand, smiled. The protagonist declared with delight that it was time to work. The animals and the man who looked like a big black cat told the short man that he had a big beard. He only responded with an apology because he was born that way. And the third guy with ears asked how much oil it took him to style it. The protagonist began to admire everything and said that it all started with an elf. And here, there was a fantasy race for every taste, although they differed from the guy's imagination. Lazar replied that there were no pure-blooded elves left, there were only half-elves. The beastman continued to say that anyone could be found in this city. The protagonist stood and watched the others. The boy looked at the hard-working people who were preparing food and drinks for others. The waiters were serving food, while others were eating, drinking, and chatting. One couple was talking about a place. The guy was saying that there were beautiful dog girls there, and then he said that it was his turn to speak. The guy said that the most expensive girls are only in Rainy Willow, and his approach was original, because the girls themselves chose their men. The guy continued to say that the prices there were exorbitant, while another said that he'd practically won, because he'd never have spent that much money on a girl, and another justified himself by saying that he hadn't spent that much. The protagonist walked and listened, thinking that there was some crazy story on every corner. The protagonist walked along, thinking he was in an amusement park. His eyes were running wild, he didn't know where to go. Suddenly, he noticed a large crowd. In the crowd, the workers, including the girls, said that they were accepting applications for hunting and asked people to wait in line. The girl was handed out sheets of paper to crowds of people. The protagonist said that the place was already full this morning, and his friend replied that at this time there is usually a crowd of hard-working adventurers and newcomers, all dreaming of snagging a lucrative order. Naruhito said he didn't think it was a good idea to get involved in this crush, and the beastman replied that registration would take time, so for now he just suggested they watch. Suddenly a man passed by and pushed Lazar. The man shouted at him to get out of the way, and the beastman apologized. What was there to be disgusted about? Looked at him and said that beastmen were an abomination. The huge man asked if he was a pickpocket and added that he should not even dream of robbing him. The beastman bowed and asked for forgiveness, adding that he did not want to cause him any inconvenience, suggesting that the protagonist move on. The main character stopped his friend and took him by the shoulder. Naruhito told the man that it was not his friend who crashed into him, but he himself. The main character added that when he looked beyond his belly, the man saw nothing, and the ill-wisher became angry. Lazar stood in front and covered his friend with himself, while the hero asked if he was serious, and the beastman, asking forgiveness again for his companion and for his rudeness, received a blow to the stomach, and the man ordered him to close his mouth. The ill-wisher pointed at the protagonist and asked if he'd understood correctly that he'd just attacked him. Naruhito, meanwhile, stood up and asked if everything was okay, to which he agreed. The man added that if they don't want problems for you, you should leave this place right now, and suddenly, the guys from the crowd offered to look at this. The guys from the side noticed that Zil was bothering someone, and noticed the lizard among them, and offered to take him into slavery for some extra money. The man told Zil not to get carried away like last time, because he didn't want to clean up the corpses after him. The man remembered a boy who came from the wilderness, and Zil attacked him and took his girlfriend, to which the man replied that it was his own fault, as that was the law among the Antaurus. Lazar suggested that his companion leave, as they were attracting unnecessary attention. The main character walked forward and apologized to his friend, because he couldn't do otherwise. The young man stood opposite the ill-wisher, who did not understand what he was doing. The protagonist asked his ill-wisher, first insulting him by calling him fat and deaf. The young man began to think that his drunken, stinking body had long since betrayed the monster within him. The protagonist looked at him, and saw in him a piece of fat with crooked proportions and a huge belly, skinny legs, and capable of fighting only with his belly. Naruhito realized that he could finish him off, while the ill-wisher himself was asking him what nonsense he was muttering under his breath. The main character noted that there was a deaf man, a blind man, and now also a brainless man, a complete set, which irritated his opponent. The man rushed to attack, holding out his hand and threatening to finish him off. But the protagonist grabbed hold and hit the man. The ill-wisher knelt down, and the protagonist noted that he had not expected more from the beer barrel. The protagonist stood in front of the man, and thought that he was like a monkey, standing there at the table to inherit, smelling like carrion, and dull as an axe. The hero stepped on the man's neck, thinking the world would be a better place without him. Naruhito said that if the man screamed that he would kill him, it meant he was ready to give up his life. The protagonist's friend grabbed him by the shoulder and asked him to stop. The protagonist narrowed his eyes and cursed silently. Naruhito thought about the fact that now he really does decide who lives and who does not. Don't take your foot off the enemy's neck. The main character smiled and said that he didn't care anymore, because there was no point in changing anything, and he laughed and continued to advance on the man while he asked him to stop. Suddenly, an arrow was aimed from behind Naruhito, and a female voice ordered him to stop. The girl started the bow and did not remove her sight from the guy. The shooter advised the dark-haired youth not to make a move. The protagonist asked who she was. The girl replied that she was in charge of the dungeon today. The shooter went on to say that she was something of a supervisor for such passionate idiots as they were, and she would very much like it if they didn't give her work. The beastman grabbed the boy by the shoulder again and asked him to stop. The protagonist raised his hands and only sighed. The girl thought for a moment and said that the main character gave off a disgusting wind. The shooter continued to judge the hero, that he smelled of a vile bloodstain, but at the same time, it was a scorching warm wind, and it was a strange, unnatural whirlwind. The girl made the comparison as if good and evil had mingled into a single seething mass. The protagonist replied that since he reeked of blood so much, she couldn't blame him, since her own hands probably weren't very clean. Lazar called out to the hero and tried to move, but the girl ordered him to move, saying that the beloved child of the villain Floria, shrouded in the wind, sadly, but he frightened her no less than a man. Suddenly, people began to gather in crowds, and looked at the girl with the silver braid, and could not believe that it was the same one. People said they were seeing her in person for the first time, since she spent all her time in the dungeon. Afterward, people started talking about the guy who had gotten into a fight with Zil, and began recognizing him as the dragon collector. The girl lowered her bow and replied that it was getting noisy here. The girl asked if he could turn slowly towards her. "Don't give up," the main character agreed and slowly turned to the girl, after which he froze in shock. The protagonist recognized her as Van Fibrana. The protagonist remembered that very arrogant face. The archer smiled and wanted to introduce herself as a former shooter from the group of heroes, but the main character interrupted her and named all the data, pointing a finger at her and saying in surprise that she was also here. This information made the girl very angry. The protagonist's friend was surprised, and the hidden quest, knowing your name, was activated. All the quest conditions were met, as he retained the memory of her name, causing the relationship to change from friendly to hostile. Suddenly, the girl put the guy on his shoulder blades and held him by the hand. The new mission's objective was to survive an encounter with a raider from Van Vibran's tower. The girl looked menacingly at the boy and asked how he'd learned her name. Lazar called out to Naruhito. The archer continued to hold the protagonist and told the beastman that if he even tried to move from the spot, he would not live. The girl began to use her magic. The archer pointed her hand at the beastman, and he flew back. The girl told the protagonist that she would ask again. Venfibrana squeezed the boy's hand and asked who he learned her name from, and ordered him to answer immediately. People around started whispering and did not understand what kind of fight was going on. The people wanted to come closer, but the girl shouted at them not to come any closer as they were a bunch of rabble. Lazar rose from his seat. The beastman was in pain and couldn't move. The protagonist asked the girl what she was doing, since she had introduced herself to him in the tower. Asked if she had completely lost her memory. The girl said she didn't understand what he was talking about and ordered him to answer immediately or she would kill his lizard friend. The protagonist asked if it was she, calling her an elf with a bow. The girl replied that she was not an elf. Suddenly the girl began to use even more force, and the main character noticed that his friend asked her poorly why she was so angry and asked her to calm down. The girl agreed and replied that she would simply kill him and find out everything from the wind. Naruhito, frightened, asked what the line from the Japanese pop song was, to which the girl simply wished him dead. The main character got angry and told her that now she herself would die. The beastman called out to his friend again. The protagonist used blade magic at maximum power in the minimum range, noticing that his friend was standing outside the blade's radius. Naruhito smiled evilly and came to the verdict that he could tear the girl to shreds. Suddenly, the main character realized that he had failed, and the girl's magic had also weakened. Suddenly, a light appeared behind the heroes. A girl intervened in the fight, stepping forward. The special condition of friendship with the dragon collector was fulfilled, and a new route opened. The beastman couldn't believe what he was seeing, nor did the other heroes. The protagonist noted that this was either a good thing or a terrible thing, but the girl appeared on time, as always. Draco appeared before them. The girl smiled and replied that she was glad to see that he was alive and well, turning to the main character. Draco looked up and replied that she hoped the archer could control herself. The girl continued to say that without a hero, she cannot even distinguish good from evil. Draco smiled and said she felt sorry to see the servants, who had lost their master, succumb to delirium. The archer turned to her interlocutor. The angry archer asked if she had decided to try to insult her like that. The girl stepped on the main character and said that all the years they traveled around the world, she had only just hatched from an egg. The archer asked when she could boldly undress that filthy mouth. Draco asked once if he dared to be so insolent, calling her a pathetic lackey. Draco shrugged and replied that, as she saw it, the year did not make them deadly, reasonable, and far-sighted, and the girl opposite was an example of that. The girl ordered to immediately remove the leg from the main character's body, and the archer asked the girl if he was the one to whom she was so strongly attached. Looking down, the archer added a question. Is he the man who took the girl's life? The protagonist was a little irritated by this mention. Draco, embarrassed, looked up, laughing, and asked if she was jealous. Archer, she said, refusing, saying she didn't need someone who reeked of blood. The girl said to look at him because he was rotten in his living form. The protagonist replied that it was offensive. Draco turned to Naruhito. Embarrassed, the girl asked him to wait a bit and promised to definitely save him. She also asked him to let her friend go immediately to relieve his cough. The protagonist blushed. I was very surprised by this statement, and asked about the fact that between the dragon and the dragon slayer, there should only be clinging and hatred for each other. Draco replied that it was definitely none of her business, and noted that she definitely didn't have anyone left whom she could call her friends, which took the girl by surprise. Draco smiled maliciously, haughtily covering his mouth and calling the girl a poor thing. The archer asked what she was talking about, and the dragon replied that she was only connected to the chosen one. The poppy dissolved into the tower walls. The thief vanished into the darkness, the holy sword fell, and now, among her departed comrades, she would meet her end alone, said the dragon. The caterpillar asked if she should tell the ugly dragon creature about this, who was lying beside human life, because there was no place for her in this world. A battle of words took place between the chosen one of the stars itself and the heroes, the hated king and the supreme being, created as the crown of the universe to bring forth all creatures and bind the very flesh of the world to his will. The archer asked if she was alone after this. Draco replied that not long ago she had been exactly like them, but now they were very different from her. The dragon added that now she was able to find the one. The girl found her husband who killed her, who so treacherously dissolved their union. The dragon added that he was a tyrant who decided to decide fate according to his whim, and recalled the moments they shared together. Looking at the guy, she replied that he was her friend. The dragon replied that this was her last warning, addressing the girl as rabble. Draco ordered her friend to be released, determined. The archer looked at her and refused, because she would not change her decision. The main character got tired of waiting and turned to the girls. Naruhito said to stop ignoring him and making a scene in front of everyone. The guy added that the blade had been ready for a long time and began to giggle while the others tried to call out to him. The archer jumped away from the protagonist and he slowly began to stand up, channeling his magic. Naruhito, you noticed the girl had pretty good reflexes. The archer asked in horror if he wanted to kill everyone here. The protagonist refused and said that he would have been able to cancel his skill in time and save his life, since a second was enough for him. The archer asked him if he was mentally ill, and the guy replied that she was talking complete nonsense, because he had been tested for mental disorders and was considered absolutely normal. The girl began to slowly approach forward and call out to the main character. Naruhito greeted Draco and told her she had survived after all. He asked her if she held a grudge against him. Draco replied that she would not comment and sighed, expressing how hard it was to live with humans. The protagonist apologized to the girl for dragging her into this. The dragon replied that only a dragon slayer was allowed to stand near her. The archer stood at a distance and became very angry, saying that they were irritating her. The protagonist was serious, and the dragon was smiling, while the archer looked down. Suddenly, a scream was heard, and a man flew between the heroes. The student tried her best with the mar count until the plump man with the mustache replied that today had been a very hard day, and almost cried. The dragon said that she was busy and tried to kick him out, but the Marquis did not understand what she was talking about, and added that it was not safe here, and also asked the man to leave. The Margrave trembled, and the protagonist replied that he seemed to be the ruler of the entire territory. The man begged God to stop them, as this couldn't go on. The protagonist understood him, as his finger was numb, and a girl approached, addressing the heroes with the deepest respect. The girl with glasses was serious and walked forward, while the Margrave was glad that his prayers had been answered. The girl with glasses looked forward and was a little scared. The girl turned to the noble keeper of the great empire, the dragon collector, and to the honorable member of the heroes group, Venfabrana. The archer turned to the girl, asking if she dared to disturb her, calling her Hyde Marie. The girl was confused and tried to say something. Gaining confidence, Hyde Marie said that if her words offended them, then she was ready to take responsibility for it, but she was the guildmaster of this guild, and it was her duty to protect the adventurers. The girl with glasses added that she did not want them to drag the adventurers into their feuds. Hyde Marie bowed and waited for an answer while everyone remained silent. Draco replied that even though she was a dragon, she was still a tower-rank adventurer. The archer added that the ban on duels throughout the guild was a special clause added exclusively for tower rank holders. The protagonist thought that everyone had finally calmed down, while the Margrave angrily thought about the fact that he asked the guy to calm them down. The protagonist suggested the girls end their argument for the day. The dragon didn't like this. She asked if he was serious about it, since the archer had tried to kill him. The protagonist replied that he himself was no better, having wanted to kill everyone here, adding that sometimes it's cool to do old people a favor. The man was shocked, and Draco was surprised by such a statement. The protagonist approached the archer, asking for forgiveness for what he had said earlier, and he promised not to repeat what he had said again, or blurt out anything unnecessary. The girl didn't believe him. The protagonist was amused and surprised, saying that this was the very valor of one of a group of heroes who couldn't trust even one person. The archer was angered by this statement, but she resigned herself to it. The girl apologized to the Margrave for the trouble she had caused, and I promised to make a formal apology later. The count bowed to her and replied that it would be very kind of her. Hyde Marie also thanked the girl for her prudence. The archer waved and finally asked the black-haired man's name. The protagonist introduced himself as Naruhito Toyama. The girl welcomed the protagonist to the city of adventurers and prayed that their paths would not cross again. The girl, using magic, was about to leave and said goodbye to the newcomer with a vile wind. All the heroes breathed a sigh of relief, and the dragon told the boy that he had silenced her with words alone. Draco was smitten with the young man, but the protagonist asked her how he could compare to her strength, and that with her, no one was scary. The girl blushed and called him a flatterer and forgave him, saying he could still praise her. The young man asked how she came to be here, and the girl replied that everything was obvious. Extending her hand, Draco replied that she was looking for the main character. The young man didn't understand what she was talking about, just like everyone else, and the girl added later that the Taraiji tea was of the highest quality. Everyone was sitting on a chair, and in the middle there was a table with tea. The dragon asked those around him to relax, as they were not to blame for anything. Hidemari bowed her head and turned to the great dragon collector with gratitude for having mercy on the hero. Draco replied that it was she who had brought them so many problems and asked them to raise their heads. The girl bowed her head and asked the owner of the house for forgiveness. The Margrave was greatly surprised by this and asked Marie if he had misheard and fainted. Hidemari apologized for the man. The dragon replied that everything was fine. Draco asked Naruhito how long he would be standing there. Draco tapped the sofa and smiled, inviting her to sit next to him. The girl added that only in Russes can someone sit next to her, and the lizard allows him to sit next to her, but only on a stool. The man thanked the great dragon for the honor of sitting next to her, and only the protagonist asked if his friend was sure. Lazar replied with a serious expression that he wouldn't refuse and would sit next to the lovely lady, since he had already caused him a lot of stress today. Naruhito hesitantly agreed. The protagonist sat down, and the lizard brought himself a stool. The dragon suggested getting straight to the point. The girl replied that she, Naruhito, and the beastmen wanted to form a group. Marie asked in surprise to clarify who would be in the group. The dragon listed herself and the two guys sitting next to her. The main character, confused, replied that he had not signed up for this. Marie told the dragon she was very sorry, but the guild had clear rules for forming groups and provided a document outlining them. The dragon clarified which specific rules were preventing her from doing so. The girl began to explain that the dragon possessed the rank of a tower of the highest rank, summoned by both the Empire and the guild. Draco agreed. Marie continued to say that for safety reasons and to prevent abuse, group members may differ in the frame by no more than 1 notch. She thus explained that the dragon could not be in the same group with these gentlemen because it contradicted their rules. Draco was greatly surprised by this statement. The protagonist added that they hadn't even had time to register, and Draco asked if he was joking and asked Maria what rank new adventurers are assigned after registration. The guildmaster replied that they usually assign newcomers rank 4. The protagonist was surprised that the girl cared about these rules. Draco replied that guild rules were a matter of communication between the guild and the adventurers, and they, a proud race of dragons, were accustomed to keeping their promises. The dragon asked if it would have been possible to at least grant him first rank. Marie replied that, even after going through the extensive procedures and filling out paperwork, it was impossible. The guildmaster added that the maximum they could award new recruits was rank 3, and to achieve such a high rank, they had to bring merit to the guild, obtain the guildmaster's permission, and be approved by the right chamber and the council. Dragon was surprised and hadn't even known there were ranks lower than rank 2. Draco pointed her finger at the main character and added that he killed the dragon, which was a great achievement. Marie replied that this was a great achievement, but still not enough to advance to rank 1. The dragon was angered by these conditions, but she relented. The girl hoped and said that you would get the first rank as soon as possible. Sadly, the dragon added that she wants to be in the same group with Naruhito. The protagonist remarked that the girl was downright cute, not like a child. Draco was embarrassed by this, and Naruhito told her not to worry, as they'd catch up quickly, they wouldn't be working like mad for gold anyway. The protagonist asked whether the order would be more reliable if the rank was higher. Marie agreed, and added that the difficulty would also be appropriate. Naruhito found this logical, and asked the dragon how she even knew that he intended to become an adventurer. The girl turned away and replied that she didn't want to talk about it. Draco responded confusedly, as if she had been watching him, so she would refrain from answering. The protagonist understood and asked if she'd been following him. If she was praying, then he was right. The girl began to justify himself by saying he hadn't specified his destination in the letter, and she was worried. Marie wondered if the dragon really was a collector. Now the dragon looked like the most ordinary girl, and Draco replied that she came to the city, bought a house, and then she had other plans that she did not voice. Marie thought the Margrave wouldn't believe it if she saw it with her own eyes. The protagonist replied that he would try to rise in rank as quickly as possible, and the girl said he had to do so as quickly as possible, and suddenly grabbed him. Draco started sniffing the main character, and he started asking why she was doing this, or rather, whether he stank, even though he had taken a shower and washed his clothes recently. The girl got angry and replied that this stench usually comes from angels. The protagonist sniffed his sweater until the girl called out to him. Draco asked if he'd met with church representatives, to which someone responded affirmatively and reminded him of the girl with the scroll, which only angered the girl further. The protagonist said that many things had happened and they needed the help of a minor saint, and so they made a sacred blood oath. Draco angrily said that she allowed him to live as he pleased, but she would not allow him to live as an angel's servant, because she could not stand those greedy hens, and she did not dare offer an oath to her killer. The girl asked what the terms of the oath were. The protagonist replied that the life of one boy would be exchanged for the church bringing 50 platinum coins by winter. The dragon understood. The intimidating girl looked at the guy and asked if he could earn money himself. The young man replied that, like her, he does not break promises. The dragon was delighted with this statement and told him to prove his words in action and crush the feathered creatures to dust. The girl summoned the ghosts of Farner. The girl in the maid costume replied that she had already sent the familiar to the Church of Angels. The dragon ordered to milk everything that was happening there for something. She obeyed. And everything that, apparently, and the squeak right now with foam at the mouth, is performing a strange dance. Draco responded with horror that it looked like she would have to remind who she had crossed, but suddenly the main character called out to her. The guy extended his hand and thanked her for standing up for him. The girl, confused, asked what he wanted. The protagonist asked if he could shake her hand. Draco was delighted and smiled sweetly. The girl took the guy's hand and asked what the questions were, and agreed. The protagonist replied that she was squeezing too hard, and the girl replied that she had to go and still had a lot to do. The girl told him to work as an adventurer, and he wished to see her soon. Draco asked Marie to keep an eye on the fools, and you replied that you would do so. The dragon stood at the portal together with the maid girl, who bowed. The main character noticed that they had evaporated. Marie said with a smile that perhaps it was late. The girl greeted the new adventurers. The guild worker smiled and congratulated the heroes on registering with the Adventurers Guild, and was about to briefly explain the system and warn them that they had now reached rank 4. The girl said the first type of work involved taking an order and, once it was completed, returning to the client. They then received a special token, which they exchanged for money at the registration desk upon returning to the guild. The second method was even simpler, hunting, where they took orders directly from the guild and brought them the ingredients. The worker told them that if they wanted to hunt, the guild could offer them weapons and provided them with documents. The protagonist was surprised by how everything was arranged. The girl suggested going into another room for a weapon, and the main character went forward. Naruhito greeted the man at the table and said they had been sent here with permission to carry weapons. The man pointed ahead and told them to choose whatever caught their eye. Looking behind him, the main character saw many spears, swords, shields, daggers, and other weapons. The protagonist was a little surprised and, picking up the mace, began waving it around, excitedly telling Lazar that it was a real mace. The beastman asked why he hadn't brought a sword or some other weapon. Naruhito asked, looking at his friend, what was the need for such complications? Because, with a mace you can just hit and everything will be ready, because he had something to cut with. The protagonist made up his mind, and told the man that he would take the mace, and he only gave him a thumbs up in approval. The protagonist put the mace behind his back and said that it was perfect because it could have been hidden. The main characters left the building and headed outside the city. The boys walked forward, while people stared and whispered, looking at the beastmen and the dark-haired boy. The young men pulled up their hoods, and the protagonist was fired up with an idea, while his friend asked him what he had come up with. The protagonist said that first they needed to go hunting and establish connections with traders. Naruhito noted that the merchants depended on the guild for supplies of materials from monsters, and these materials were obtained by those very same adventurers. Lazar understood him and asked if this meant that they should take them into circulation. The protagonist said that any merchant benefits from having a reliable adventurer who consistently supplies reliable materials, and that personal connections with merchants will be useful, as then they will open their own bakery. Naruhito said that they should show the results first, and Lazar added that they should choose a target to hunt. The protagonist said that he had already prepared for this and took out a package from under his cloak and asked his friend to read it, since he himself did not know how, and Lazar began to open the book. Recommended targets for beginners were listed there, such as monsters up to rank 3 that roamed around the city. There was a shaggy goat, a horned hare, and a smiling bird. The protagonist hadn't expected the guild to provide such information for free, which demonstrated Marie's foresight. Lazar noted that, judging by the dusty stacks, no one had picked up these booklets before, even though they contained quite a lot of useful information. Naruhito said that, judging by this, many of the adventurers are idiots who don't know how to manage information. Lazar asked who they would be hunting. The protagonist smiled and showed the Titan serpent from the booklet, saying that it looked just right. Lazar was very surprised and asked if he was serious, since it was a rank 1 monster. The protagonist replied that his skill was particularly well suited to fighting such creatures. Lazar was upset and replied that if he said so, then he agreed and suggested looking ahead. The beastmen pointed to the eastern gate and said that if they submitted a claim, they would be granted access to the plains for hunting. The protagonist said that the wall was indeed huge, and Lazar added that there were rumors about how they built them to contain dragons. And suddenly, a male voice was heard ordering them to stop. The knight stationed at the gate said that passage was only for licensed adventurers. The knight added that citizens and travelers pass through the western gate. The protagonist showed his badge and said they were adventurers. The knight chided them for their bronze badges and asked angrily if they had a hunting permit. Lazar agreed and presented the permission slip. The knight angrily took it from him and reproached him for his lizardmen race. The knight asked if the guild was now accepting such people, saying they had sunk to the lowest depths. Lazar thanked the Empire for its generosity. The knight barred the lizardmen from even thinking about doing anything against their country, lest he cut off his fingers. Lazar replied that he would keep that in mind. The protagonist noted that Lazar was trying to behave decently, and that he should restrain himself for the sake of his friend, and said that they had everything in their hands, and now they should let them through. The knight became angry and asked what he was talking about, since he should show respect. Lazar replied that it was a patrol from the angelic church. The beastmen said that if they got in their way, they would lock them up. The protagonist replied that he was fed up with this attitude. The knight replied that he didn't care anymore, and that only one last thing remained, and extended his hand to the heroes. The angelic ambassador said he was expecting a fee and a commission, asking if the guild shouldn't have explained this to him. The protagonist replied with irritation that it was the first he'd heard of it. The knight replied that he was sorry to hear this and called out to his comrades, saying that the educators from the guild had forgotten to explain about taxes, and had already warned the heroes that they either put their money on the barrel or leave. The knights began to crowd around and demand money even more loudly. The protagonist was amused by the fact that such blatant extortion took place among the knights. The knights continued to say that they just had to pay and pass. The angel's messenger asked if he had money, and if not, they could go to prison for interfering with church affairs, since it didn't matter to them what they chose. The protagonist apologized for wasting his time and asked him to wait, reaching his hand under his cloak a little longer. The knight was delighted and said the boy was smart, and if he'd paid right away, he wouldn't have had to scold them. The knight added that the girls could be paid in cash, but the lizard and the men could only be paid in hard cash. The angel's ambassador remembered a girl from the village whom he had not seen for a week, but the other reproached him that it was his own fault and continued to discuss her because she was from a rich family. The ambassadors continued to say that the girl had settled down somewhere in the slums, having been too stupid to move to the pleasure quarter. The protagonist grew angry and said that, before he paid, could he clarify one thing? The protagonist asked how their church felt about dragons, while Naruhito saw system arrows appear above the knights. The men were surprised and ordered them to pay as quickly as possible or face prison. A system emerged, stating that church patrols must hear certain words to accomplish a goal, either persuading or intimidating the church patrol. The protagonist responded that he asked out of curiosity. Naruhito said the guild master had grumbled that someone at the east gate was posing as a close friend of the dragon, without the guild or the church's knowledge. These words confused the knights. The knight asked if he was the one, to which the protagonist replied that he had revealed it, and he asked to wait a minute and he would find them the pledge, taking a coin from the bag. The protagonist mockingly said he'd made a mistake and pulled out the wrong coin, which was irredeemable but had been given to him by a close friend. And if he paid them with it, she'd be very angry. The young man added that he would have to tell who exactly demanded money from him, and smiled maliciously at the knights. The knights recognized the golden token, worthy of the rank of the tower, and uncertainly wondered whether this meant that it was connected to the dragon. The knight flatly refused to accept this fact, and snatched the medallion, calling it a mistake. His hand trembled, but he replied that it was a toy fake, and immediately felt pain. the knight collapsed to the ground. The knight's comrades realized that the medallion was genuine, as it had previously been said that if anyone below the rank of Tower touched this token, misfortune would befall them. The knights didn't believe that he was the same one, and in the church reports they wrote, "The slave adventurer who killed the dragon collector," a black-haired guy in the company of a lizard. The knights ordered the boy to immediately remove his hood. The protagonist agreed and took off his hood with a smile on his face. The knights noticed that he was the same black-haired guy, and it turns out that he is a dragon killer. The protagonist warned them to listen carefully if they wanted to make the guild and the dragon enemies of the church. The guard backed away, and the protagonist said that the Adventurers Guild was currently conducting a cleanup and identifying those involved in bribery and corruption. The protagonist began to take the medallion in front of the knights, who were caught off guard. The knights couldn't understand how he could wield it, or whether it was because he'd killed the dragon. The protagonist remarked that it was clever, but these ill-wishers wouldn't give themselves away so easily. The young man added that people were saying that they had found a newcomer to the investigation, someone the dragon had recognized but who was still green enough to be pressured. The protagonist added that this newcomer was unreliable and the knights were serious. Naruhito said he doesn't like unnecessary problems. The protagonist replied that he thought the newbie could do that. The young man, removing the coin, said that he should report that this was all complete nonsense, and that they were not collecting money from anyone. Naruhito said that maybe all the people in the church are law-abiding and good people. Having removed the coin, Naruhito addressed the respected knights with a certain smirk. The guy asked how much money they had to pay for the passage. The protagonist narrowed his eyes and resolutely waited for an answer. A system appeared stating that the hero had been granted passage, but their relationship with the guards had changed to hostile, and the guards now saw them as a threat, which could force them to remain silent or reach those they held dear. The knights opened the passage. The main characters moved forward while the knights realized that they had lost and were left with nothing. Lazar asked his friend if he was sure of what he had done, to which the young man agreed. The beastmen noticed that he really didn't like their accompanying glances. The protagonist advised his friend to take 10 deep breaths. The friend agreed. The guy replied that he would take the necessary measures. Naruhito used blade magic on the knights. Naruhito walked without turning around. The young man ordered the blades to tear the knights apart. Lazar realized what was going on and informed the guy about it. The protagonist said that they could now proceed without unnecessary fear. The heroes continued to move forward. The system revealed that 6 church guards had been eliminated, and their relationships with the guards had been reset. There were no witnesses, and no charges would be brought for their deaths. The protagonist responded that they got what they deserved. The heroes emerged from the passage and were very surprised, looking at the sky. A vast, clear sky with stars was presented to the boys. The main character was delighted with what he saw.